The story begins on the jagged edge of a continent, where cliffs meet the Atlantic and winds shape the lives of those who dare to stand against them. Portugal was small in land but vast in imagination, a kingdom that grew out of the slow, patient work of reconquest and settlement along the Iberian fringe. Its people learned early that the sea was not a boundary but a horizon, not a threat but an invitation. That attitude, like a soft, steady current, would lift them into a century of exploration and empire. Every wave carried a dream, and every shore a story. Subscribe and write in the comments if you feel that pull more in the explorers who left or in the hearts that waited for them. In the towns and castles, in the monasteries and marketplaces, the memory of conflict with the Moors lingered, shaping a restless, outward-looking culture. The Reconquista had been a crucible. It taught techniques of war and governance, the rewards of territorial expansion, and the necessity of maritime supply lines. Portuguese nobles and clergy alike found in conquest both a spiritual narrative and a practical program for wealth and prestige. That fusion of piety and profit would animate the voyages that followed, giving them the moral and fiscal energy to persist. Geography pressed on Portugal like a constant tutor. The country's coastline is serrated with inlets and capes, its harbors exposed to the full sweep of the Atlantic, and its people forced to reckon with tides and storms as matters of daily survival. Yet those same winds, once understood, became engines of movement. Fishermen turned pilots, and coastal skippers learned to read currents and clouds as if they were pages of a book, skills that later transformed into the art of long-distance navigation. Maritime innovation did not arrive all at once. It accumulated in workshops and shipyards, and conversations over tavern tables, and the stubborn experiments of carpenters and sailors. The caravel, light and nimble, emerged from that genius for adapting to the ocean's moods, its lateen sails allowing for better windward performance than older hull designs. Instruments like the astrolabe and the quadrant, along with new charts that borrowed from Arab and Mediterranean knowledge, gave sailors a measure of the sky and a way to place themselves upon it. These tools turned anxiety into calculation and made distant voyages thinkable rather than fantastical. At the heart of the early maritime surge stood a figure whose name became a magnet for myth, Prince Henry of Portugal, often called Henry the Navigator. He did not sail as captain on most voyages, but he gathered minds and resources, founding a school of navigation at Sagres where cartographers, pilots, shipwrights, and patrons met. Under his aegis, wealth flowed toward voyages of exploration, and state support began to link private enterprise with national ambition. That blend of royal encouragement and private risk created a template for the expeditions that would follow. The first chapters of Portugal's outward story were measured in island chains and coastal settlements rather than in sprawling empires. Sailors first probed the nearby Atlantic, colonizing Madeira and the Azores, and experimenting with plantation economies based on sugar. These islands were laboratories where navigation was practiced and plantation agriculture refined, often through the forced labor of enslaved people. In this way, the Atlantic archipelagos were not peripheral curiosities but prefigurations of the larger imperial order to come. Portuguese ventures along the West African coast followed, beginning with trading posts and fortified enclaves that served as nodes in a growing commercial web. Ceuta, captured at the beginning of the 15th century, served as an initial prize and a strategic base that both alarmed and inspired. As voyages moved south, ports like Argan and later São Jorge de Mina gained importance as places where gold, ivory, and people changed hands. Trade with West African polities was complex and often negotiated, revealing a web of relationships in which Portuguese power was persistent but rarely absolute. The coastline itself was a teacher in patience and prudence. Explorers learned to hug the shore when opportunities presented themselves, to pause and mend ships, to trade and observe. They traded beads and cloth for gold and local goods, learned languages, and often married into local elites, producing mixed households that blurred the lines between colonizer and colonized. Yet alongside these alliances there were also raids, forced labor, and the construction of fortresses that announced a growing willingness to use armed force to secure trade routes. One should not think of conquest and commerce as separate streams. They braided together as the Portuguese extended their reach. Naval fortifications like Elmina were built to control both the sea and the trade that moved along the coast. These forts were not merely military installations but centers of administration, warehouses of goods, and symbols of a new permanence. They testified to a new logic: control the points where wealth concentrated and you could command the sea lanes that fed the growing empire. To trace the foreign horizons that Portugal would cross, it helps to listen to the voices of sailors and merchants who described the ocean as a living thing. They spoke of doldrums where the ship hung like an insect in a still web, of trade winds that arrived like consistent breath, of currents that could either carry them home or strip them to the edges of their resolve. Navigation was not only technical, it was also a practice of patience and intuition, honed by countless small decisions and by the social structures aboard ship. Captains, pilots, and crews each performed roles that had to be trusted for survival. The technological and navigational advances found sturdy currency in the figure of Bartholomew Dias, who in 1488 rounded the Cape of Good Hope and confronted a new geography. Dias's voyage proved that the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans connected, that a sea route to the riches of Asia was possible by way of Africa's southern tip. The news of his achievement leapt across courts and markets, transforming abstract possibility into practical strategy. With that knowledge, merchants and monarchs began to imagine Portugal not merely as an Atlantic power but as a bridge to a wider world of spices, silks, and empires. The culmination of this line of effort was the voyage of Vasco da Gama in 1497 to 1499, a journey that reached the Indian Ocean and landed Portuguese agents in Calicut on the Malabar coast. Da Gama's arrival carried both wonder and violence, diplomatic exchanges, and the blunt commerce of force. The sea route opened new circuits of trade that brought pepper, cinnamon, and other spices into European markets without middlemen operating from the Levant or Red Sea. That was not only a commercial revolution, it altered power balances across continents. The discovery of Brazil in 1500 by Pedro Cabral was at once an accident and a chapter in a larger navigational logic. Cabral's fleet, blown off course or deliberately sent across the Atlantic as part of a wider strategy, encountered a verdant coastline that would become a different kind of colony. Brazil's sugar, later coffee, and gold tied vast landscapes to Portuguese mercantile designs and required labor-intensive agriculture that in practice meant the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Here again global connections bred new local realities, and those realities had profound human costs. To make sense of territorial claims, treaties were drawn and papal bulls issued, as in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the unclaimed non-Christian world between Portugal and Spain. Such agreements were less about lines on maps than about the mutual recognition of each crown's right to expand and profit. They reflected a Eurocentric legal imagination that attempted to order the sea and land as if sovereignty could be parceled by ink and consent, often without regard to the people already inhabiting those places. The Portuguese Empire was, in its earliest phase, mercantile and maritime rather than continental. It was a chain of forts, trading posts, and maritime routes sprawling across oceans, from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Indian Ocean rim and beyond. This network resembled a necklace more than a continuous landholding, each node connected by ships and currencies, by letters and the lives of sailors who made repeated voyages. Such a structure permitted flexibility but demanded constant naval power and logistical effort to maintain. Administratively, the Crown experimented with different forms of governance, blending royal prerogative with delegations of power to captains and governors. The crown granted monopolies and contracts to private merchants, while also building a central bureaucracy that sought to extract revenue and manage diplomacy. Over time, institutions developed to oversee shipping, customs, and the appointment of colonial officials, creating a hybrid system in which public authority and private initiative interwove. This hybridization was both a source of strength and a seed of tension as rival interests jostled for advantage. Alongside merchants and captains, missionaries were early and influential agents of the empire, particularly the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits. They sought to convert souls and to create cultural footholds, establishing schools, churches, and communities that often acted as intermediaries between Portuguese authorities and local populations. Missionary activity carried genuine spiritual conviction as well as political and cultural consequences, reshaping languages, family structures, and indigenous belief systems. The zeal to Christianize became part of the rationale for imperial expansion, even as it sometimes softened the edges of conquest by building local churches and vocabularies. Contact zones where Portuguese sailors first met new peoples were intense mixtures of trade, curiosity, misunderstanding, and violence. In places like Goa, Malacca, and Macau, the Portuguese planted themselves in cities that were cosmopolitan hubs of Asian trade. They built churches and fortresses, negotiated with local rulers, and navigated complex social networks of merchants from Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. These urban enclaves were microcosms of the larger global circulation of goods and ideas, and they reveal how empire often relied on negotiation as much as on force. In Africa, the Portuguese presence transformed coastal economies and politics in ways both unintentional and deliberate. West African kingdoms engaged with Portuguese traders for firearms, textiles, and metal goods, which altered balances of power and warfare. The influx of European goods reoriented local production and consumption, and the trade in enslaved people expanded dramatically in scale and scope. Portugal's maritime empire was thus implicated early on in the creation of the Atlantic slave system, a tragedy that linked African societies to plantation economies across the Americas. The creation of sugar plantations on Atlantic islands and then on Brazilian soil established a labor system that demanded scale and coercion. Enslaved Africans were brought to work in brutal conditions, their labor forming the backbone of the colonial economy. The profitability of sugar was immense and drove further expansion, fueling investment in ships and forts and entrenching social hierarchies that would last for centuries. The human cost of this wealth was profound, degrading lives and cultures even as it transformed diets, tastes, and economies in Europe. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese arrived into established circuits of trade with sophisticated polities, from the sultanates of the Malabar coast to the Muslim merchants of the Red Sea and the powerful rulers of Southeast Asia. Portugal sought to insert itself into these circuits by controlling ports and sea lanes, and by using naval firepower to coerce favorable trading arrangements. This often brought them into conflict with Muslim merchants and empires who had long dominated these routes, and it sparked a series of naval confrontations that would define regional balances for decades. Naval technology and the Portuguese willingness to arm trade ships gave them a distinctive advantage in some contexts, but those advantages were not permanent. The ocean could never be held by an empire alone. It demanded constant vigilance, replenishment, and adaptation. The cost of maintaining armed convoys and fortified outposts was high, and the crown had to weigh the expenses of defense against the profits of trade. That calculation shaped policy and often determined which posts were held, abandoned, or reinforced. Cartography matured as a practical art under Portuguese patronage, transforming voyages into recorded knowledge that others could read and follow. Portolan charts, which had long guided Mediterranean sailors, met new information about wind patterns and coastlines to create more expansive maps. Portuguese pilots compiled routes and kept meticulous logs that, over time, produced a shared body of navigation knowledge. This mapping of the world was not merely geographic, it was also epistemic, producing a way of thinking about distance, place, and the global order. The human stories embedded in the archives of the empire are many and varied. There are letters from captains describing the wonders of foreign courts, petitions from merchants seeking monopolies, and marginalia in ship logs bristling with fear at storms. There are also records of births and baptisms of mixed families, accounts of cultural exchange in cuisine and dress, and devastating ledgers of human cargo. These documents conspire to show that empire was at once administrative procedure and intimate human drama, a tapestry of bureaucratic forms and private sufferings. Lisbon, the capital, became the epicenter of this global commerce, a port city where exotic goods converged and where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed. Spices perfumed the markets, silks shimmered in shop windows, and new wealth funded palaces and churches, transforming the urban landscape. The city's prosperity gave Portugal a prestige that far exceeded its modest geographic size. Yet that prosperity was brittle, vulnerable to the oscillations of markets and the pressures of maintaining far-flung possessions. Portugal's imperial ambitions inevitably brought it into competition with other European powers, whose maritime aspirations grew as the early Portuguese successes became known. The Spanish crown was an immediate rival, and later the Dutch and the English pressed into the Indian Ocean and American waters, often challenging Portuguese monopolies with superior capital and naval organization. Over time, the state of the European balance of power, shifting alliances, and new commercial practices would hollow out much of Portugal's preeminence, even as its initial advances reshaped the world. The appointment of captains and the granting of monopolies produced a social class in Portugal with vested interests in empire, merchants, privateers, and contractors who made fortunes and sometimes fell into ruin. This class cultivated networks of patronage that linked the metropole to colonial officials and merchants abroad. Their fortunes funded further voyages, and their failures could ruin families and destabilize local economies. The presence of such actors meant empire was a site of constant negotiation between individual gain and royal strategy. Mercantilism, the dominant economic logic of the time, framed the empire's aims as increase in bullion and control of trade. The belief that national wealth depended on favorable balances and accumulation of precious metals incentivized ventures into gold-producing regions and in the control of spice routes. Such thinking pushed the crown to secure ports and to tax trade heavily, sometimes to the detriment of nimble private trade. In this way, economic theory shaped policy even as material realities tested its assumptions. Religion provided a moral architecture for expansion, as popes issued bulls that sanctioned Christian missions and sometimes divided non-Christian lands between Catholic monarchs. The rhetoric of spreading Christian light functioned as both a genuine spiritual project and a diplomatic tool for garnering support at home. Missionaries often saw themselves as mediators between cultures, and their records contain both ethnographic curiosity and cultural imperialism. The religious impulse was therefore entwined with commerce and politics, making conversion a facet of colonial governance. In Asia, Portuguese settlements like Goa became administrative hubs, centers of trade, and places of cultural synthesis. Goan society in the 16th century was a layered mix of Portuguese settlers, Luso-Indian families, local elites, and diverse merchant communities. Churches stood near temples and mosques, markets sold spices abundantly, and local artisans blended European and Indian styles in architecture and dress. Such hybrid cultures complicate simple narratives of conquest, revealing how imperial presence could generate new forms of identity and daily life. Malacca, captured in 1511, was another pivotal prize, a choke point that controlled trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Securing Malacca allowed Portuguese ships easier access to the layered markets of Southeast Asia, where nutmeg, mace, and cloves were produced. Control of such hubs also invited resistance from regional powers and rival merchants who resented the disruption of long-standing trading norms. Yet the Portuguese presence in these ports demonstrated how strategic control can amplify the reach of small states when they command critical nodes of commerce. The Portuguese flirtation with China and Japan opened different kinds of imperial experiences, characterized by trade-based enclaves and intercultural exchanges that were sometimes unexpected. In Macau, a community of traders and missionaries negotiated a delicate client relationship with Chinese authorities, balancing trade privileges with cultural diplomacy. In Japan, Portuguese goods, especially firearms, entered local conflicts and altered the dynamics of power among the warring samurai. These interactions remind us that empire is neither monolithic nor uniform, it adapts to local histories and practices. The Jesuits emerged as particularly influential in Asia, establishing schools and translating texts, while also sometimes advising rulers and negotiating on behalf of the crown. Figures like Francis Xavier carried Christian teachings across oceans, combining spiritual zeal with a pragmatic appreciation for local languages and customs. Jesuit scholars produced detailed accounts of Asian societies that informed European knowledge and sometimes softened the edges of imperial claims through cultural engagement. Their work complicates simple condemnations or praises, revealing the multifaceted nature of missionary activities. Trade in commodities like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg reshaped diets and economies in Europe, turning spices into markers of status and altering culinary practices. Beyond spices, silk and porcelain from China became coveted luxury items, while silver and gold from the Americas and Africa rebalanced monetary systems. The circulation of goods was accompanied by the movement of people, ideas, and diseases, producing a global interdependence that was unprecedented. That interdependence produced both wonder and devastation, enrichment for some and ruin for others. Disease played a grim role in the early centuries of contact, often decimating populations with little understanding of causality. Epidemics spread along the same routes that carried spices and fabrics, reshaping demographic landscapes and weakening societies in ways that sometimes facilitated imperial encroachment. At the same time, the movement of new crops and animals, like maize, cassava, and horses, transformed agricultural systems across continents in both positive and destructive ways. The biological exchanges of the era were elemental, redesigning diets and ecosystems as surely as political borders. Cultural exchange operated on many levels, from cuisine and language to costume and craft. Portuguese words entered African and Asian vocabularies, while local practices slipped into Portuguese homes and taste. In music, architecture, and material culture, hybrid forms emerged, testifying to a give-and-take that undercut simplistic categories of dominance. These cultural flows were neither equal nor benevolent, but they were persistent, and their legacies can still be found in the cuisine of Goa, the language of Brazil, and the rhythms of Cape Verde. Yet for all the riches and prestige, empire proved expensive to sustain. Costs tended to exceed revenues as maintenance of forts, regular naval patrols, and diplomatic missions drained the royal coffers. The narrow land base of Portugal meant that taxation was limited, and the economy could be destabilized by bad harvests or military setbacks. Such fragility made the empire vulnerable to shocks and created a perpetual tension between the desire for expansion and the need for consolidation. The Iberian Union of 1580, when Portugal entered a dynastic union under the Spanish Habsburgs, marked a turning point whose consequences were both immediate and long-term. Portuguese possessions became entangled in broader European conflicts, making them targets for Spain's enemies, particularly the Dutch and the English. The Union diluted Portuguese autonomy and foreign policy while exposing imperial holdings to new forms of attack. This period accelerated the erosion of Portuguese exclusivity in Asian trade as well as the loss of Atlantic posts to more powerful competitors. The Dutch, with their rising maritime entrepreneurship and efficient colonial companies, presented a formidable challenge. They attacked Portuguese forts, seized spice islands, and disrupted trade routes, employing both military might and commercial cunning. The Dutch East India Company's model of corporate governance and capital aggregation outpaced the Portuguese reliance on crown support and private adventurers. In turn, Portugal's naval defenses and commercial networks strained under such pressures, illustrating how empires that do not modernize their economic strategies risk being overtaken. England and France also encroached, establishing their own footholds and forming alliances with local powers that resented Portuguese influence. These new rivals brought different legal and financial instruments to empire building, often backed by state support that matched or exceeded Portuguese resources. Over decades, the balance of power shifted as command of the sea meant not only guns but also capital and the ability to sustain prolonged campaigns far from home. The Portuguese Empire, small in population and stretched thin, found itself outmatched in some theaters. Nevertheless, Portugal retained important nodes in the global system, and its cultural imprint persisted long after political control waned. Portuguese became a lingua franca in parts of the Indian Ocean and West Africa, and Luso-African and Luso-Asian communities created durable cultural forms. The economic and cultural legacies of Portugal's early expansion are visible today in legal systems, religious practices, and in the spread of crops and culinary techniques. To call the Portuguese contributions purely exploitative would be to flatten a complex history of exchange and coercion. Yet empire always meant imposition and resistance, and across regions resistance took many forms: diplomatic, economic, military, and cultural. Local rulers adapted their strategies, sometimes allying with the Portuguese, sometimes resisting violently, and sometimes finding new economic partners among the sea powers who contested Portuguese dominance. Where cooperation prevailed, hybrid institutions arose. Where antagonism simmered, conflict could become protracted. The interplay between resistance and adaptation made imperial control uneven and often ephemeral. The plantation economies of Brazil matured into complex societies that blended European, African, and indigenous elements, producing new social hierarchies and cultural expressions. Slavery in Brazil was particularly brutal and on a scale that transformed demography and social relations. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of everyday defiance to large-scale rebellions and the formation of quilombos, maroon communities of escaped slaves, who maintained African traditions while forging new identities. The persistence of these communities is a testament to human resilience against a system designed to erase autonomy. Portugal's maritime law evolved as well, shaped by the needs of long-distance commerce and by diplomatic negotiations with other European powers. Treaties addressed piracy and the rights of passage, while customary practices emerged for salvage insurance, and maritime contracts. Maritime law was not merely abstract. It governed real disputes over lost cargoes, the distribution of prizes taken in war, and the responsibilities of captains to their crews. Such legal frameworks helped to normalize the risks of oceanic trade and enabled complex transactions that crossed oceans and cultures. The cultural memory of the Age of Discovery in Portugal became entangled with national pride, religiosity, and narrative of heroic sailors braving the unknown. This memory would be invoked by later generations to justify colonial policies and to explain Portugal's place in the world. At the same time, as critiques of colonialism emerged in later centuries, the celebratory narratives were challenged by accounts that foreground exploitation and violence. The tension between these narratives persists and invites deeper reflection about memory and responsibility. Cartographers and chroniclers like João de Barros and Fernão Lopes de Castanheira tried to record the unfolding empire, often mixing admiration with pragmatic detail. Their chronicles provided Europeans with new images of distant peoples and lands, but these accounts are shaped by the vantage points and assumptions of their authors. Reading them today requires attention both to the factual content and to the rhetoric that framed overseas subjects as objects of curiosity and control. Such texts are windows into a world being invented even as it was being described. The economic consequences of empire for Portugal were paradoxical: massive inflows of wealth at times, but also a dependency on specific commodities and markets that made the economy brittle. Periods of precious metal inflow could inflate prices and distort economic development at home, while the costs of defense and administration could exceed the perceived gains. In the long run, Portugal struggled to diversify its economy and to harness the benefits of its overseas commerce into a sustainable industrial base. This economic dynamic contributed to a relative decline compared to Northern European powers which industrialized more successfully. The Atlantic world that Portugal helped to create was not merely a space of extraction, it was a space of human creativity and adaptation. New musical forms, religious syncretisms, and linguistic blends emerged from the contact zones of empire. These cultural productions often arose from the margins and the oppressed, producing forms of resilience that outlived political domination. The human mind finds ways to create meaning even under coercion, and the cultural legacies of the Atlantic reflect that stubborn inventiveness. Innovation continued to mark Portuguese seaborne activity, improvements in shipbuilding, better understanding of global wind systems, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about currents and monsoons. This technological and practical knowledge diffused across European navies and merchant classes, raising the general capacity for long-distance navigation. Portugal, as an early laboratory of oceanic exploration, helped to seed a broader European maritime revolution that reconfigured global connections. Yet the initial lead it held gradually narrowed as others learned and adapted. The Portuguese experience with mixed-race communities and cultural hybridity created new social categories that would shape colonial societies for generations. Terminology and social rankings emerged to classify varied ancestries, and these classifications had implications for legal rights, social mobility, and access to power. The social fabric of colonial societies became a palimpsest of identities shaped by conquest, colonization, and everyday interactions. Understanding these categories helps to see how colonialism penetrated intimate realms of family, marriage, and identity. As the 17th century advanced, new sources of wealth in Brazil, particularly sugar and later gold, shifted the center of gravity of the Portuguese imperial economy. Gold discoveries inland created new migrations, towns, and political dynamics, while sugar continued to underpin trade in the Atlantic. These resources complicated the imperial ledger. They offered renewed income but also demanded infrastructure, labor, and security that were costly to maintain. The empire's capacity to extract value depended on a continuous interplay of local management and imperial oversight. The story of Portuguese maritime empire is not only one of triumph and decline but also of legal and cultural inventions that lasted long after political control changed. Property laws, marriage contracts, and religious institutions established during the early centuries became durable structures in colonial societies. Even when political sovereignty shifted, the social, legal, and cultural residues of Portuguese governance persisted, testifying to the deep imprint of early modern imperial practices. Artists and architects traveled with the empire's currents, bringing Baroque churches to Goa, Manuline portals to Lisbon, and new aesthetic forms to coastal towns. These physical markers of empire are visual evidence of how wealth and faith were materialized in stone and paint. At the same time, local artisans adapted European motifs to local tastes and materials, producing a distinctive architecture that spoke to hybrid identities. Such artistic exchanges are audible too, in music and liturgy, where divergent traditions found new harmonies. The maritime networks established by the Portuguese facilitated exchanges that were not always planned or desired by metropolitan authorities. Smuggling, illicit trade, and the informal circulation of goods often undercut official monopolies, creating secondary economies that fed local elites and sailors. These unofficial flows reveal the limits of central authority and the adaptability of traders who sought profits wherever they could. Such shadow economies were part of the dynamism of the early modern world and a symptom of the difficulties in policing a global empire. Piracy and privateering were constant hazards for commercial vessels, and at times state policy blurred into sanctioned theft as privateers attacked rival nations' shipping. Captured prizes enriched crews and investors but also precipitated reprisals and diplomatic crises. The thin line between legitimate commerce and state-supported predation reflected the competitive and often violent atmosphere of maritime trade in the 16th and 17th centuries. For Portugal, protection of merchant fleets was an ongoing priority, one that required naval resources and diplomatic finesse. The maintenance of empire required a steady flow of information, and Lisbon became a node for letters, logs, and reports from around the world. The crown relied on a chain of correspondence, governors, captains, missionaries, whose dispatches informed policy and commercial decisions. Over time, bureaucratic practices developed for handling that flow, including systems for censoring, copying, and storing information. These information networks were the nervous system of imperial administration, turning far-flung events into actionable knowledge. Slavery and forced labor systems were not monolithic across the empire. They varied by region, by commodity, and by legal formulation, yet shared a core of coercion and exploitation. African slavery in the Atlantic had different labor regimes than indigenous forms of servitude encountered in parts of Asia, yet both served to underpin extractive colonial economies. The human suffering embedded in these systems left long scars on societies and created political and social dynamics that would haunt post-colonial eras. Reckoning with these legacies is essential for understanding modern disparities and cultural complexities. Resistance and negotiation also produced syncretic religious forms that blended Christian elements with indigenous and African cosmologies. In many places, local practices were adapted to Christian rituals, creating devotions and saint cults with distinctly local inflections. This process signified not only imposition but also cultural survival and transformation, revealing the agency of colonized peoples in shaping spiritual life under colonial rule. The result was a patchwork of religious life that enriched global Christianity while reflecting complex histories. Portuguese imperial ambitions reshaped global finance, encouraging the growth of credit instruments, partnerships, and maritime insurance. Merchants devised bills of exchange and other financial devices to smooth transactions across time and space, allowing capital to fund voyages and to distribute risk. These financial innovations were among the hidden engines of empire, enabling the mobilization of resources on a scale that simple treasure fleets could not sustain alone. The financial revolution thus made possible the sustained expansion of maritime trade. The imprint of Portuguese words and customs in former colonies remains palpable. Languages such as Portuguese became national tongues in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, while Creole languages emerged in other spaces, carrying grammar and vocabulary that testify to centuries of contact. Place names, culinary traditions, and legal vestiges remain visible, and in many cases these elements have been reappropriated by post-colonial societies as symbols of identity and resistance. The cultural afterlife of empire is thus contested, layered, and ongoing. As European powers widened their reach, global politics became the testing ground for alliances, antagonisms, and imperial strategies. Portugal's early lead opened doors for others, and the patterns it established, forts, convoys, and trading posts, were replicated and adapted by rivals. The story of the Portuguese Empire is therefore not separable from the larger history of early globalization. It was both a cause and an effect of the processes that knitted continents together into new networks of exchange and conflict. The role of women in the imperial story is often underrepresented but crucial. Women in the metropole supported voyages through investment and influence, while women in colonial contexts navigated complex social hierarchies, managed households, and often mediated relations between cultures. Luso-Asian and Luso-African women played important roles in trade networks and kinship ties, and their stories reveal the intimate side of empire, how family, marriage, and gender shaped colonial outcomes. Their lives remind us that empire was built not only by sailors and soldiers but also by those who managed domestic and economic life in shadow and sunshine. Language itself became an instrument of power and adaptation. The Portuguese language carried administrative authority and religious doctrine but also adapted to local sounds and vocabularies. Translators and interpreters were indispensable figures, often bridging worlds with skill and subtlety, and sometimes serving as cultural brokers who shaped the meanings of encounters. The multilingual reality of many colonial ports shows how communication was an active site of negotiation and hybridization. In the realm of knowledge, the empire stimulated curiosity about foreign plants, animals, and medicines, encouraging botanical gardens and medical exchanges that enriched European science. Naturalists collected specimens and reported on new crops like sugar, cacao, and cassava, which would transform diets and agriculture globally. Such exchanges contributed to an early scientific revolution grounded in observation and classification, though often mediated by imperial power and the exploitation of colonized peoples and ecosystems. Portugal's legal and administrative experiments in distant territories influenced later colonial models. Viceroys, governors, and local councils were prototypes for how European states organized rule across oceans, and the balance between metropolitan control and local autonomy became a recurring problem. The challenge of providing justice, collecting taxes, and ensuring defense in far-off places was not unique to Portugal, but its solutions and failures informed other empires and future colonial administrations. Over time, the Portuguese monarchy attempted reforms to modernize revenue collection and tighten control, but such reforms encountered local resistance and limited capacity. Corruption, the autonomy of colonial elites, and the sheer distance of outposts made reform difficult to implement. The structural tensions between central authority and peripheral autonomy were persistent and helped to explain why the empire sometimes seemed to unravel as quickly as it had been stitched together. The longue durée of Portugal's global presence shows both continuity and change. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, Portuguese actors adapted to new economic realities, negotiated with emergent colonial rivals, and reimagined their role in a transforming world. While political dominance receded, cultural and linguistic legacies persisted, and the early modern Portuguese project had irrevocably altered the map of the world and the patterns of human connection. Art and literature from the period provide another lens on empire's human dimension, with poems, travelogues, and moral tracts reflecting both wonder and anxiety about distant lands. Writers wrestled with the theological and ethical implications of conquest, produced vivid travel narratives, and sometimes romanticized the voyager's life. These texts shaped European imaginations and helped to justify or critique imperial action, contributing to a public conversation about the meaning and consequences of expansion. Pirates and privateers who preyed on Portuguese commerce added drama and volatility to the seascape. Their raids could cripple merchant ventures and prompt diplomatic crises, and sometimes privateers operated with tacit state support as instruments of policy. The figure of the corsair, half criminal and half naval auxiliary, complicates visions of lawful empire, showing how maritime power often relied on a mixture of formal authority and informal violence. The environmental consequences of empire were profound and often marginalized in early accounts. Deforestation for shipbuilding, the introduction of new crops and livestock, and the reorientation of land use for plantations reshaped landscapes across continents. Rivers and coastlines were altered by new economic uses, and ecosystems were transformed in ways that affected local populations' subsistence and ways of life. The ecological footprint of empire is a crucial dimension for understanding the full cost of global expansion. Military encounters with established Asian and African polities sometimes exposed the limits of European naval superiority. Coastal artillery and local knowledge of tides gave regional powers ways to resist, and diplomatic skill was often more decisive than brute force. These battles and negotiations unpack the myth of inevitable European dominance, revealing moments when local strategies protected autonomy or forced compromises that limited imperial reach. The use of religion as a legitimizing force sometimes sparked backlash, as Christian proselytizing clashed with deeply rooted local spiritualities. In some regions, conversions were tactical, tied to trade advantages or legal protections, while in others missionaries gained sincere adherents who formed new communities. The interactions between worldviews produced tensions and accommodations, and the outcomes were rarely total victory for either side. Religious change was patchy, contested, and persistent in its complexity. By the 18th century, Portugal's global network had become a mixture of enduring posts and lost territories, held together by merchant networks, familial ties, and the residual prestige of an old maritime tradition. The empire adapted by focusing on profitable nodes and by renegotiating relationships with emerging European powers. Yet the momentum of history, including industrialization elsewhere and changing geopolitical tides, meant that the era of Portuguese preeminence was passing into a different phase characterized by competition and recalibration. History moves fast, and even the greatest powers have to learn to start over. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you feel closer to the pride of what was built or the courage it takes to begin again. The abolitionist movements and changing moral economies of the 19th century began to challenge the institution of slavery that had sustained many colonial economies. Debates over morality, economics, and human rights filtered back to Portugal, where political reforms and international pressure gradually brought legal changes. These changes, however meaningful on paper, had complex practical effects, as economic structures and social hierarchies did not dissolve overnight. The end of legal slavery marked the beginning of new social struggles and a rearrangement of labor that shaped 20th century societies. Throughout these centuries, the human cost of empire remained a central, painful reality: the displacement of peoples, the suppression of cultures, and the trauma of forced labor created legacies that would persist across generations. Acknowledging those costs does not erase the instances of cultural exchange and hybrid creativity, but it insists that we understand the full dimensions of historical consequence. The voices of the colonized, often silenced in the archives, must be brought into the story to balance the narratives of triumph. Education and missionary schools became vehicles for colonial governance as well as instruments of cultural formation, producing elites who were conversant in Portuguese ways and sometimes served as intermediaries. These schools spread literacy, technical skills, and religious instruction, but they also eroded indigenous forms of knowledge and authority. The result was a class of colonial collaborators who could negotiate with metropolitan structures while being rooted in local societies, creating a complex web of loyalties and tensions. Technology continued to evolve, and with the Industrial Revolution in Northern Europe, Portugal found itself at a new disadvantage in terms of armament and industrial capacity. Naval architecture and armament became capital-intensive, favoring powers with larger industrial bases. Portugal's inability to match this industrial scale limited its ability to reform naval forces and defend dispersed holdings, contributing to the empire's gradual contraction in the face of modernized rivals. International diplomacy in the early modern and modern periods reconfigured imperial boundaries as treaties, wars, and economic pressures redrew maps and altered colonial relationships. Portugal's treaties with other powers often reflected a balance between preserving access to trade and acknowledging the limits of military power. Diplomatic negotiation became a principal tool for preserving what could be salvaged from the once expansive if fragile system of overseas possessions. Yet even as the political map changed, the cultural memory of empire persisted in literature, architecture, and national narratives, often contested and reinterpreted by successive generations. Debates about commemoration, reparations, and historical responsibility continue to animate public life in Portugal and in former colonies. These debates reveal the unfinished business of empire: how to remember, how to reconcile, and how to rebuild equitable relationships in the shadow of historical injustice. Portuguese-speaking nations today: Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and others, bear witness to the extension and transformation of Portuguese influence across centuries. Each of these societies has its own story of colonial encounter, resistance, adaptation, and independence, reflecting a range of experiences that defy any single narrative. Their languages, legal forms, and cultural repertoires are living testimonies to the long reach of the early modern voyages that began off Portugal's Atlantic shore. Historians continue to debate the motives and consequences of the Portuguese expansion, weighing ambition against necessity, commercial interest against religious zeal, and innovation against exploitation. This historiographical conversation shows how our interpretation of the past changes with new evidence, new moral frameworks, and new questions. The Portuguese Empire is thus both a subject of scholarly inquiry and a mirror for contemporary concerns about globalization, inequality, and the moral costs of power. The dawn of the Portuguese Empire was a moment when a small Atlantic kingdom became a catalyst for a new global order, creating connections that would bind continents together in commerce, conflict, and conversation. Its sailors discovered sea routes that changed trade, its forts anchored new political realities, and its cultural exchanges produced hybrid forms that would reshape societies. The story is neither wholly heroic nor wholly monstrous. It is a human saga of curiosity, courage, greed, cruelty, and creativity. Listening to this story, one hears the creak of timbers, the clap of waves, the chatter of markets, and the hush of chapels where new languages took root. One also hears the quieter, harsher tones of suffering, of ropes and chains, of the absence of those who were taken and sold. These sounds layered together make up an Atlantic chorus whose echoes remain audible today, demanding both attention and reckoning. The navigational charts and logs that guided early sailors remind us that knowledge is an instrument of power, and the mapping of seas and peoples was inseparable from the ordering of empire. But the very same maps also carry within them the contours of contact, showing routes where cultures met and where new identities formed. To read these maps is to read a story of world-making that has shaped modern life in ways both visible and obscure. As Portugal's global role shifted, it remained a broker of cultures and a transmitter of ideas, foods, and fashions, even if its direct political power waned. The Portuguese legacy, with all its contradictions, thus offers a textured lens through which to understand the early modern transformation of the world. The dawn of empire was not a single event but a prolonged process, full of sudden pivot points and slow changes, of human agency and structural pressures. In the end, the Portuguese age of discovery reveals something larger about history, that small beginnings can have outsized consequences, that technology combined with audacity can reconfigure the globe, and that every expansion carries both creation and destruction. The voyages that began off the small Atlantic coast of Portugal opened a new chapter in human history, one whose chapters continue to be read and rewritten as we grapple with the legacies left in their wake. The ocean begins as an argument between land and sky, a restless stretch of silver that both invites and threatens, and for Portugal it became a language the nation learned to speak. Portugal was small on the map but large in imagination, a place where navigators, merchants, and monks looked out and saw not emptiness but possibility. That hunger to move outward would shape centuries of conquest, commerce, and encounters across the globe. In the 15th century, Portugal set itself apart by turning its attention to the sea, not as escape but as opportunity, and the reasons were practical and urgent. The Mediterranean trade routes were controlled by established powers, and the Iberian Peninsula's position suggested a different path, round Africa into the Indian Ocean, where spices, silks, and wealth awaited. Behind that strategic decision lay a culture that prized maritime skill, a royal family willing to invest, and a class of men ready to risk their lives for profit and glory. Prince Henry of Portugal, known to history as Henry the Navigator, did not sail many voyages himself, but his role was decisive because he organized, financed, and imagined. He gathered pilots and cartographers, funded expeditions along the African coast, and created an early form of a school of navigation that turned practice into knowledge. Under his patronage, the caravel, a nimble ship capable of sailing windward, became a tool of expansion, and a new map of the Atlantic took shape from the reports of those who returned. Those first voyages were experiments in seamanship and survival, where sailors learned to read currents and winds and to live on salt pork and hard bread. They discovered islands like Madeira and the Azores and found the map of the Atlantic dotted with new landfalls that turned the ocean into a network instead of an abyss. Each return brought not just goods but new techniques, new charts, and a more confident belief that distance could be measured and overcome. Navigation itself evolved. Instruments like the astrolabe and crossstaff allowed mariners to find latitude, and the emergent art of cartography stitched together coastal observations into charts. But often the real teachers were the sea and the people who lived along its shores. Sailors learned from African pilots, traded for fresh water and food, and sometimes fought for supplies. Those contacts were complicated and uneven, sometimes generous, sometimes coercive, and they set a pattern for an empire that mixed diplomacy with force. The Portuguese crown learned quickly that small forts and trading posts could control trade more efficiently than large territorial conquest in some regions. Feitorias, the stone warehouses and fortified trading stations, became nodes in a network stretching from West Africa to the East Indies. In these places, the Portuguese did not always intend to rule populations directly. They intended to control flows of goods, gold, ivory, slaves, and spices by holding choke points along sea routes. On the West African coast, the Portuguese sought gold and access to the trans-Saharan caravan trade routed through Timbuktu and Gao, and those early contacts reoriented Atlantic economies. They established fortified enclaves at places like Elmina, which became centers of exchange where European goods met African gold and captives. These encounters would, over time, create dependencies, and change local political dynamics as coastal rulers learned to manipulate European demand and as Europeans learned African diplomacy and warfare by necessity. Meanwhile, exploration rounded a psychological corner when Bartholomew Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa. His rounded prow announced that the Indian Ocean could be reached by a sea route under European control, and that discovery reshaped horizons. It also demonstrated the unpredictability of the sea. Wind patterns, storms, and currents were no longer mere hazards but elements to be mastered. Vasco da Gama's voyage to Calicut in 1498 completed the maritime link between Europe and Asia, and the impact was immediate and profound. Portugal now had the technical capacity to bypass overland Muslim-controlled routes and to bring pepper and other spices to Europe at far greater scale and at enormous profit. The success in reaching India triggered a surge of capital invested in fleets, fortifications, and a global system of trade that had never existed before in the same way. The Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean altered centuries-old networks. Asian merchants had long connected the ports of East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China, and these systems were sophisticated and mutually dependent. The Portuguese introduced a more militarized and monopoly-driven approach, building forts at key points like Goa, Hormuz, and Malacca to control trade by sea. Those bastions were more than military posts. They became administrative centers where the Estado de India tried to hold together a sprawling and diverse empire. Afonso de Albuquerque stands out as an architect of Portuguese imperial strategy in Asia, a man who combined naval boldness with an administrative mind. He captured Goa and sought to make it the capital of Portuguese power in the east, and he seized or sought to control key maritime chokepoints to force commerce through Portuguese hands. His policies were aggressive, often brutal, and they established a template: control the harbor, tax the ships, and if necessary, use force to back up commercial claims. The Portuguese influence extended further into Southeast Asia as they captured Malacca in 1511, a crown jewel in control of the lucrative spice trade that moved pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and mace across the region. Malacca was a hub where Malay, Chinese, Indian, Arab, and European traders met, and its conquest signaled that Portugal would no longer content itself with mere coastal outposts. Yet the Portuguese could not easily hold everything, and the dynamics of local power, monsoon winds, and competing Asian states limited their reach. In the islands of the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands, cloves and nutmeg were worth their weight in gold to European markets, and the Portuguese sought to dominate both production and transport. They built forts and established monopolies, but geography and local resistance made absolute control difficult. These islands would later become the center of violent competition with the Dutch, whose growing naval power and mercantile energy challenged Portuguese supremacy. Back across the Atlantic, a claim that had been incidental at first grew into something far larger when Pedro Álvares Cabral anchored in what would be called Brazil in 1500. The Portuguese initially saw Brazil as a source of dye and timber, but the land would become central to the empire's wealth through sugar and, later, coffee. Colonization there took a different shape from Asia and Africa, often involving large plantations, settler families, and the intensive use of enslaved labor imported from Africa. Sugar transformed Brazilian society and the Atlantic economy, creating a plantation complex that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangular trade. Portuguese sugar planters built mills and estates along the coast, and they relied on the labor of enslaved Africans to cultivate cane and process it in boiling houses. The scale of the industry drove demand for human cargo, feeding the growth of the transatlantic slave trade and reshaping demographics across 3 continents. The slave trade itself was perhaps the most tragic and consequential feature of this period, an enterprise in which many Portuguese merchants and imperial officials participated. Captives were taken in African wars or traded by African middlemen and shipped across the ocean under appalling conditions, a commerce that enriched some at the terrible cost of millions of lives and the destruction of families and societies. The legacy of that trade would linger for centuries, producing deep scars in Africa and forming new identities and cultures in the Americas. Missionary zeal was a parallel engine to profit and power, and it shaped Portuguese encounters as much as mercantile motives did. The crown partnered with the church through papal bulls that granted Portugal the right to evangelize and govern newly discovered lands, and missionary orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, and most influentially the Jesuits, followed in the wake of merchants and soldiers. Conversion efforts were complex. Some were genuinely spiritual, others were tied to political control, and many blended local and Christian practices into new forms of belief. Francis Xavier and other Jesuits traveled across Asia with an energy that matched merchants and conquistadors, and they sought to build Christian communities amid vastly different cultures. In some places, like parts of India and Japan, missionaries made converts and built schools, while in others their efforts met resistance or produced hybrid forms of worship. The Jesuits were often among the most learned Europeans in contact with Asian elites, and their knowledge of languages and local customs sometimes opened doors that merchants and soldiers could not. Yet conversion also meant coercion in many cases, and the introduction of Christianity often accompanied cultural erasure or disruption. Temples and religious leaders were sometimes supplanted, indigenous rights were condemned, and social orders rearranged in the name of salvation. That mixture, benevolence and violence, education and suppression, characterizes much of the Portuguese religious legacy abroad. The practicalities of running a global empire pushed the Portuguese monarchy to create administrative institutions that tried to manage trade, taxation, and defense from Lisbon. The Casa de India became a royal warehouse and regulatory body that supervised shipments of spices, precious metals, and ships, and it tried to assert a crown monopoly over the most profitable trades. The system centralized control but created bottlenecks and incentives for illicit trade and smuggling, because local realities on the ground often demanded flexibility that the Casa did not provide. Local governance relied on captains, governors, and private holders of land known as donatarios in places like Brazil, where the crown delegated settlement to noble grantees in a bid to encourage colonization. Those captaincies often failed because of limited resources, conflict with indigenous peoples, and the difficulties of financing distant ventures. Over time, the crown tightened control, reorganizing territories under royal governors and viceroys to bring more direct oversight to the colonies. Fortifications were the architecture of control. Thick walls, cannon, and bastions marked the places where Portuguese power claimed permanence. Forts at Hormuz, Dio, Sofala, and other harbors were both military strongpoints and symbols meant to intimidate rivals and reassure allies. They also required constant resupply and manpower, turning them into logistical challenges that drained resources and forced hard choices about where to concentrate effort. The Portuguese Empire was never a uniform body. It was a patchwork of trade stations, city-states, plantations, missionary enclaves, and small colonies, each with its own character and challenges. In some places, European law and institutions took root, giving rise to towns with churches, markets, and councils. In others, the Portuguese presence was a thin veneer over robust local polities that continued to operate with significant autonomy. That unevenness made the empire adaptable but also fragile, vulnerable to rivals who could pick off the weaker points. Competition grew predictable as other European powers, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, sought their own shares of the profitable Asian and American trades. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had tried to divide the world between Spain and Portugal along a meridian, but that neat line could not contain the messy realities of expansion and rival claims. In the long run, national rivalries, mercantile energy, and military innovation would push the Portuguese into defensive positions against better funded or more aggressive competitors. The Dutch proved to be one of the most formidable challengers, especially in the East Indies, where the Dutch East India Company used military power and commercial organization to seize many Portuguese holdings. The Dutch took Malacca and contested the Spice Islands, and their intrusion weakened Portuguese monopolies and forced them to retreat from some regions. This phase showed the limits of the Portuguese model. Small in population and stretched across vast distances, Portugal could be outmaneuvered by rivals with more capital and naval resources. In India, the English and French would also establish footholds, exploiting Portuguese weaknesses and local divisions to build their own empires. The Portuguese presence in Goa endured, but their influence waned as Asian commerce adapted to multiple European players and as indigenous states found ways to circumvent monopoly. Over time, the balance of power in the Indian Ocean shifted from a single European hegemon to a contested space of competing companies and nations. Portugal's union with Spain from 1580 to 1640, the Iberian Union, was a mixed blessing. It placed Portugal under Habsburg kings who were preoccupied with European conflicts, and the Union drew Portuguese resources into Spain's wars while making Portuguese colonies targets for Spain's enemies. The Dutch took advantage of this vulnerability to attack Portuguese possessions, and the Union ultimately weakened Portuguese independence and imperial coherence. Beyond warfare, the empire altered ecological systems through the Columbian exchange and the spread of crops, animals, and diseases across continents. Manioc, maize, and sweet potatoes moved from the Americas to Africa and Asia and transformed diets. Sugar cane and bananas moved across oceans and reshaped agriculture. At the same time, European diseases devastated indigenous populations in many regions, revealing the tragic demographic consequences of contact that often accompanied conquest and colonization. Cultural exchanges were not just imposed, they were creative and unpredictable, producing new musical forms, languages, cuisines, and religious practices. Creole languages emerged in port cities and plantations, blending Portuguese with African, indigenous, and Asian tongues into distinctive vernaculars. Foods like feijoada in Brazil, a stew of beans and meat, reflected the convergence of African ingredients, European techniques, and local produce in a culinary language of empire. Architecture bore the imprint of Portuguese tastes, too, but blended with local materials and styles to create hybrid aesthetics. Manuline decoration, with its maritime motifs and elaborate stonework, left marks on churches and public buildings, while in India and Africa Baroque styles mixed with indigenous forms. Urban spaces like Goa, Salvador, and Luanda show how European planning and local life shaped new cities where markets, religious institutions, and ports coexisted. Religion remained central to identity and authority, and Catholic missionary efforts left long legacies in places as diverse as Brazil, Goa, Timor, and parts of Africa. Churches, convents, and schools became centers of conversion and often of social services, but they also became instruments of cultural assimilation. In some cases, Christianity was adapted into older cosmologies, producing syncretic practices that survived even when official European power waned. The lives of ordinary sailors and colonists were hard and precarious, defined by storms, hunger, and the constant threat of disease. Shipboard life demanded discipline, communal labor, and the capacity to endure long months at sea with minimal comfort. Yet those same voyages produced a shared identity among mariners, a vocabulary of seamanship, a set of rituals, and stories of distant ports that circulated back in Lisbon and fed the imagination of a nation. Explorers were both celebrated and mythologized, and their accounts, diaries, letters, and royal reports became the raw material of a public narrative about discovery and heroism. Those narratives often emphasized courage and divine favor while downplaying complicity and exploitation and violence, and the stories shaped how generations would remember the empire. Memory is always selective, and the Portuguese story has been retold as triumph and tragedy in different eras. The economics of empire were volatile, dependent on fluctuating spice prices, the successful harvests of sugar and other commodities, and the crown's capacity to extract revenue. The Casa de India tried to regularize profits by controlling shipments and monopolies, but corruption, inefficiency, and smuggling undermined those efforts. Moreover, profits from imperial trade were often consumed by military needs and debt, producing cycles of boom and bust rather than sustained prosperity. In Africa, Portugal created territorial colonies in places such as Angola and Mozambique that evolved differently from their Asian enclaves or American plantations. In Mozambique, the Portuguese engaged in long-term settlement and trade in ivory, gold, and later slaves, while in Angola the colony developed into a source of captives and a center for Atlantic commerce. These African colonies would endure well into the 20th century, forming integral parts of Portugal's imperial identity even as their economies adapted to new global demands. In Asia, Macau became a unique node where trade with China and Japan intersected, a place of negotiation where Portuguese merchants found a measure of success as intermediaries. Macau served as a base for trade with China, though it always had to navigate Chinese imperial authority and local regulations. The presence there produced a distinctive community and foreshadowed the longer-lived European enclaves that would manage trade in constrained but innovative ways. Japan offers another striking chapter. Portuguese ships reached the islands in the mid-16th century and introduced firearms, new goods, and Christianity, creating a period of intense engagement with Japanese rulers. The arrival of Jesuit missionaries led to significant numbers of converts and to complex relations with daimyo who saw potential advantage in aligning with Europeans. Yet by the early 17th century, Japanese rulers turned against Christianity and expelled most missionaries and traders, illustrating the limits of foreign influence when local authorities perceived a threat to sovereignty. Timor and East Timor, distant and rugged, became sites of Portuguese presence where missionaries and traders sought sandalwood and influence, and those islands would remain connected to Portugal long after other territories had been lost or transformed. The persistence of Portuguese language and culture in such far-flung places underlines how imperial ties can survive through a mixture of institutional presence, religious bonds, and local adoption. Even small enclaves could carry disproportionate cultural weight because they served as anchors for networks of language, law, and faith. The Portuguese imperial project always operated at the intersection of commerce and coercion, of diplomacy and violence, and that duality produced contested moral terrain. Where merchants saw profit, missionaries saw souls, soldiers saw targets to subdue, and natives saw both threat and opportunity for alliance. Those overlapping motives make the empire difficult to classify simply as economic or religious. It was both, and more, driven by contingencies that often produced unexpected consequences. The arts responded to empire in ways that preserved memory and offered critique. Literature, painting, and music recorded travels and encounters, sometimes glorifying the venture and at other times reflecting on its costs. Fathu, for instance, would later become associated with national melancholy and longing, and while it postdates the age of early exploration, it channels feelings of distance and yearning rooted in seafaring culture. Legal and administrative systems were transplanted and adapted to colonial contexts, producing new forms of governance and hybrid legal orders. Portuguese law and custom governed trade, marriage, and property in many colonies, yet they mixed with local traditions and practices in ways that created new norms. These hybrid institutions often persisted, shaping land tenure, social hierarchy, and bureaucratic practices long after independence movements changed political forms. Language was one of the most enduring legacies. Portuguese became the mother tongue for millions and a lingua franca in port cities and colonies, and its diffusion created a lusophone world that continues to connect disparate regions. From Angola to Brazil, from Goa to Macau, Portuguese influenced local vocabularies and generated Creole languages that embody cross-cultural exchanges. The spread of Portuguese also meant that ideas, literature, and religion moved more easily between distant places. The decline of Portuguese dominance was not sudden but gradual, shaped by competition, overextension, and the changing dynamics of global capitalism. The Dutch and English displaced Portuguese power in parts of Asia, while Portugal struggled to defend its far-flung holdings. Internal problems, economic mismanagement, dynastic crises, and the limits of a small population exacerbated external pressures and reduced Lisbon's ability to project power effectively. Yet the empire adapted in surprising ways, shifting focus to Brazil as the most valuable crown jewel, especially as sugar profits grew and later as mining booms in the 18th century produced enormous flows of silver and gold. Brazil's economic rise temporarily rebalanced the empire, drawing investment and settlers and making the Atlantic plantation economy central to Portuguese wealth. That shift also changed the demographic and social character of the empire, as Brazil grew into a far larger and more populous space than Portugal itself. The 18th century brought reforms, attempts to modernize administration, and efforts to squeeze more revenue from colonies, but those measures often produced resistance and unintended consequences. Enlightenment ideas and the example of other revolutions circulated among colonial elites and colonial subjects alike, and independence movements in the Americas would eventually reach Portuguese America. The relationship between colony and metropole grew more fraught as the costs and moral contradictions of empire became harder to justify. When Brazil declared independence in 1822 under Dom Pedro I, a member of the Portuguese royal family who had been born into the transatlantic circuits of power, the empire lost its largest and most lucrative territory. The loss forced Portugal to recalibrate, reorganizing a smaller set of colonies and confronting the realities of a diminished global role. That moment marked a symbolic contraction as well as a practical one, signaling the end of an era dominated by vast maritime empires. 19th and 20th century Portuguese policy oscillated between attempts to hold on to African colonies and the realities of growing nationalist movements and global anti-colonial sentiment. Portugal persisted in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and São Tomé, maintaining control through administrative structures and settler communities even as local movements agitated for independence. The persistence reflected both imperial commitment and internal political calculation, but the costs and international pressures mounted. The Carnation Revolution of 1974, a peaceful military coup that overthrew an authoritarian regime in Lisbon, catalyzed rapid decolonization and ended centuries of imperial rule in a matter of months. Within a year, Portugal recognized the independence of its African colonies, and the long imperial arc came to a swift and dramatic close. The process left complex legacies, displaced settlers, political instability in some newly independent states, and enduring cultural ties that would continue to shape relations in the post-colonial era. Post-imperial Portugal and the newly independent countries entered a period of redefinition, negotiating spheres of influence, economic relationships, and cultural connections. The community of Portuguese-language countries emerged later as a forum for cooperation and shared identity among Lusophone nations, trying to translate linguistic commonality into diplomatic and economic ties. These efforts demonstrate how empire does not simply vanish, its networks mutate into new forms of association and memory. Memory itself became contested, monuments, names, and historical narratives were debated in societies that had to reconcile pride in exploration with regret for violence and slavery. Museums and scholars re-examined sources, and public debates wrestled with what to celebrate and what to mourn, a process that echoes across former empires worldwide. Memory politics remains a crucial aspect of the Lusophone world as generations continue to reassess the past on moral, historical, and cultural grounds. The environmental consequences of empire are still visible: deforestation in parts of Brazil and Africa, the spread of non-native crops and animals, and the reconfiguration of landscapes for plantations and ports. These changes brought immediate economic gains for some, but long-term ecological costs that were often overlooked by imperial policymakers. In many regions, the environmental footprint of the Portuguese agricultural and extractive systems introduced patterns that continue to affect biodiversity and livelihoods. Intellectual exchange accompanied material exchange. Portuguese sailors and colonial officials collected knowledge about flora, fauna, geography, and peoples, sending specimens and reports back to Lisbon and beyond. This curiosity fed European scientific projects and contributed to an expanding body of knowledge about the planet, but it also mirrored imperial impulses to classify and control. Natural histories written in the empire combined wonder with utility, often cataloging resources for exploitation as well as study. Trade networks created diasporas, communities of merchants and laborers who settled far from the metropolis and maintained links through family and commerce. These diasporas formed business networks that could move goods and capital across oceans efficiently, and they produced hybrid identities that drew on multiple cultural traditions. The social fabric of many port cities was thus cosmopolitan, with Catholic churches near mosques, synagogues, and shrines reflecting religiously plural spaces of interaction. The Portuguese language enabled a shared legal and literary corpus that bridged continents, allowing contracts, treaties, and stories to travel in a common tongue. Lawyers, clerics, and merchants could operate in a shared discursive field, which eased administration and trade but also reinforced hierarchies of power. At the same time, local languages persisted and mixed with Portuguese, making multilingualism and translation vital skills in imperial contexts. Music and dance offer intimate windows into the cross-cultural flows of empire. African rhythms blended with European melodies and indigenous forms, creating musical traditions that traveled with enslaved peoples, settlers, and merchants. In Brazil, for instance, syncretic forms like samba later emerged from these intercultural collisions, laboring under histories of pain and triumph to create vibrant cultural expressions. Everyday life in colonial cities involved constant negotiation. Merchants haggled over prices, clerics debated doctrine with locals, and families arranged marriages that bridged different cultural worlds. Food markets sold spices from Asia alongside local produce, and streets echoed with multiple languages. Those quotidian interactions remind us that empire was built not only by grand policies and battles but by ordinary people whose lives braided together across cultural boundaries. The printing press in Lisbon and in colonial towns helped circulate information and ideas, shaping public opinion and administrative practice. Pamphlets, official decrees, and missionary reports fed debates back in Europe and provided raw material for historians and policymakers. Information flowed imperfectly, but it flowed, and that slow exchange of texts contributed to a sense of a global sphere under Portuguese influence. Not all encounters ended in subjugation. Many produced alliances, intermarriage, and mutual dependence, creating composite elites who brokered relations between Portuguese authorities and local societies. These brokers, mestizos, Luso-Africans, Luso-Asians, often occupied important economic and administrative roles, mediating tax collection, trade contracts, and legal disputes. Their existence complicated simple dichotomies of colonizer and colonized, revealing a spectrum of identities and loyalties. Medicine and health were also arenas of exchange and failure, as European doctors learned from indigenous remedies even while bringing smallpox and other diseases that devastated populations. Scrutiny of these exchanges shows both empathy and arrogance. Missionaries sometimes provided medical care, but colonial health policies often sought to protect European settlers more than indigenous peoples. Over time, medical knowledge adjusted to local circumstances, producing hybrid practices that combined European and native healing techniques. Education was a key instrument of cultural influence, with mission schools teaching the catechism, Portuguese language, and basic literacy to colonial subjects. For some, education opened pathways to bureaucratic employment and social mobility within colonial structures. For others, it became a means of cultural assimilation and loss. The Jesuits, in particular, established reputedly effective schools that trained local elites alongside European children, creating a class of literate intermediaries. Trade law and commercial practice developed as entrepreneurs innovated ways to finance long voyages, pool risk, and manage returns, foreshadowing modern corporate forms. Joint ventures, credit networks, and letters of exchange helped underwrite voyages that would otherwise be too risky for individual investors. These financial innovations spread across Europe and fed the development of modern capitalism, even though they sometimes depended on violent enterprises like the slave trade to yield profits. The Portuguese experience also stirred debates in Europe about morality, commerce, and the rights of native peoples, with some voices criticizing mistreatment and others defending imperial prerogatives. Humanitarian arguments against slavery and forced conversion would gain traction slowly, often catalyzed by evangelical and Enlightenment thought, but political and economic resistance to change remained strong. The tension between moral critique and economic interest shaped reform efforts unevenly across centuries. Legal distinctions like those enshrined in the patronage system, in which the crown controlled ecclesiastical appointments, created a complex relationship between church and state that had profound colonial implications. That system meant the Portuguese monarchy could appoint bishops and clergy, tying religious authority directly to royal power and influencing how missions conducted themselves abroad. Such institutional entanglements affected administration, culture, and the balance between spiritual aims and secular control. The Portuguese Empire's diplomatic art was often local as much as global. Treaties with African kings, alliances with Indian sultans, and negotiated access to Chinese ports depended on understanding local protocols and settling for compromise. Diplomacy could be transactional, with gifts and tribute used to secure trade, and it could also be dramatic, with hostage exchanges and royal ceremonies testing the limits of mutual understanding. Skilled interpreters, both linguistic and cultural, became indispensable in making these fragile arrangements function. The visual record, maps, paintings, engravings, crafted a European image of the non-European world and of the Portuguese role within it. Maps like the Cantino planisphere revealed how knowledge accumulated through voyages shaped imperial imagination, while paintings of Oriental markets and exotic peoples fed curiosity and justified enterprise. Yet those images were often selective, emphasizing novelty and difference in ways that supported imperial narratives. Economic monocultures such as sugar in Brazil and coffee later on created cycles of boom and bust that shaped social hierarchies and land use. When prices were high, wealth concentrated among planters, fostering elite power. When prices fell, economies destabilized and social tensions rose. Those economic dynamics had political consequences, contributing to the instability that sometimes precipitated revolts and, in the long run, to independence movements when Creole elites sought autonomy. The rise of nationalism in the 19th century reframed relationships between metropole and colony, as ideas of self-determination and popular sovereignty challenged imperial legitimacy. Colonial subjects began to imagine political futures that did not center Lisbon, and overseas populations developed their own political cultures and movements. These intellectual currents collided with material grievances, taxation, forced labor, land dispossession, to produce a wave of demands for autonomy and independence. Trade in humans left particularly persistent cultural imprints, as the African diaspora created communities whose languages, religions, and social practices braided with local traditions in the Americas and even in Europe. Practices like candomblé in Brazil or syncretic Catholicism in Portuguese colonies illustrate how enslaved Africans preserved spiritual worldviews even as they adapted to new circumstances. Those cultures would survive and thrive, producing music, religion, and social forms central to national identities in former colonies. The role of women in the empire is frequently understated but crucial. Women navigated social and commercial networks, ran households, managed estates, and in many cases mediated cultural exchange through marriage and family ties. Indigenous and African women often found themselves at the center of colonial economies, sometimes exploited, sometimes exerting agency through trade and social networks. Their stories complicate the narrative of imperial power exercised only by men and reveal a richer texture of everyday life. Architecture and urbanism in colonial ports reflected pragmatic adaptation to climate and commerce, with warehouses, churches, and fortifications close to docks and markets. Streets were planned for movement of goods as much as for grand public display, and public space became arenas for social negotiation between Europeans, locals, and diasporic communities. These cities were living laboratories of cultural mixture where law, religion, commerce, and daily routine intersected. In the courts and in the street, colonial law mixed custom and statute, creating dispute resolution mechanisms that often required eclectic solutions. Portuguese judges and legal scholars had to account for indigenous norms and European principles, producing syncretic jurisprudence that could differ markedly from metropolitan precedents. Law became another site of negotiation where imperial claims encountered local realities and adjustments were made to maintain order and extract revenue. Cultural memory lately has turned to the question of reparations and historical accountability, debates that ask how modern societies should address centuries of slavery and dispossession. These conversations are contentious because they force a reckoning with material inequalities and moral obligations rooted in the past. The Lusophone world grapples with these legacies unevenly, balancing pride in cultural achievements with calls for justice and recognition for victims of colonial policies. The Portuguese Maritime Empire also left technological legacies, shipbuilding techniques, navigational charts, and port infrastructures that became the basis for later naval development. Ports that served as lodestars for the empire often evolved into modern harbors and commercial hubs, integrating new technologies while preserving traces of their imperial past. This continuity links naval innovation to contemporary maritime economies and highlights the material infrastructures that durable empires create. Art and literature have kept the memory of the empire alive through narratives that explore identity, exile, and belonging, producing works that are both celebratory and critical. Writers from the Lusophone world have mined the empire's legacies to question power, narrate migration, and explore cultural syncretism. These creative forms provide intimate access to histories often compressed by official records, offering voices that echo across time and place. Education about the empire in contemporary schools and media varies widely, reflecting different national priorities and sensitivities. Some curricula emphasize exploration and national achievement, while others foreground exploitation and resistance. The way nations teach this history affects public perception, political debates, and the work of reconciliation, demonstrating that how we remember is as consequential as what actually occurred. Migration patterns created a modern diaspora that keeps Portugal connected to former colonies, with millions of people of Lusophone descent living across continents. These migrations intensified in the 20th century as people moved for economic reasons or as refugees fleeing conflict, and they created transnational communities with ties back to Lisbon. The diaspora sustains cultural ties through music, food, religion, and language, keeping the empire's imprint alive in everyday life. Globalization today can be traced in part to the webs the Portuguese began spinning, routes, markets, and exchanges that knitted continents together in new ways. The movement of goods, ideas, and people initiated in the Age of Discovery set a template for later global connections, even as modern globalization expands those networks exponentially. A sober view sees both continuity and rupture. The Portuguese set certain processes in motion while later actors transformed and intensified them. Historiography has evolved, with scholars challenging older triumphant narratives and highlighting marginalized voices, enslaved peoples, women, indigenous communities, whose experiences complicate the record. New methodologies use archaeology, oral histories, and interdisciplinary approaches to reconstruct lives that official documents often ignored. This broadened scholarship enriches understanding and reveals the complex human dimensions of empire beyond treaties and lists of governors. The Portuguese Empire's end did not erase the human stories that gave it life: merchants who learned new tongues, slaves who forged new communities, missionaries who wrote grammars of unfamiliar languages, and soldiers who died on distant shores. These lives were entangled in ways that made the empire both a material force and a human phenomenon, filled with contradictions, resourcefulness, bravery, cruelty, and adaptation. The narrative of empire is thus not only about policy and profit but about people who navigated a world transformed by long-distance connections. The story of language offers a continuing thread. Portuguese is both a marker of colonial past and a living, evolving tongue among millions who have adapted it to local rhythms and vocabularies. Radio shows, novels, and television from the Lusophone sphere circulate themes that reflect shared history and contemporary concerns. This shared communicative space results in cultural exchanges that feel intimate and immediate, linking Lisbon to Luanda, Salvador, and Macau through sound and story. Contemporary politics continues to wrestle with imperial legacies. Development aid, trade agreements, and diplomatic alliances often echo older patterns of asymmetric relations. Former imperial powers and newly independent states negotiate partnerships that must account for historical grievances alongside shared language and culture. These negotiations are never simple, involving economic interests, diaspora lobbying, and the politics of memory that shape foreign policy and international cooperation. The spiritual landscape remains altered by centuries of missionary work and conversion, producing vibrant Christian communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often combined with indigenous practices and beliefs. Catholic festivals, saints' days, and religious architecture persist as visible reminders of the past, while local adaptations show how religions change in contact. Religion thus functions both as a continuing cultural bond and a testimony to the transformative power of centuries of encounter. As we look across oceans and back through time, we see that the Portuguese Empire was not a single, simple thing but a constellation of practices, institutions, and people woven together by ships and smoke, by prayers and contracts. It was an experiment in governing difference across distance, an exercise in creating commerce from curiosity, and a record of human courage and culpability. To understand it fully, one must track not only treaties and forts but the intimate traces of language, cuisine, music, and family that remained when empires receded. The physical artifacts of empire, maps, letters, ruins, and churches, offer tangible pathways into the past, inviting us to imagine voyages and conversations that changed lives. Museums that hold these objects have a responsibility to present complex narratives that do not simplify or sanitize. By engaging with those materials, we can appreciate the reach of Portuguese influence and the profound ways it altered the modern world. Youth and education in Lusophone countries now reinterpret the past with creativity and critical eyes, producing art, scholarship, and activism that address both pride and pain. Young historians and artists ask new questions, challenge old myths, and build bridges across generational and national divides. Their work insists that the story of the Portuguese Empire remains active, not fixed, and that its meanings continue to be negotiated in public life. In the end, the Portuguese Empire was a story of navigation in more senses than one: navigation of sea routes, navigation of cultural difference, and navigation of moral dilemmas that come with power. Its vessels bore not only cargo but ideas and diseases, faith and resistance, and they changed the patterns of human life on multiple continents. The legacy is thus a mixed inheritance, one that invites both admiration for maritime daring and sober reflection on the costs exacted by empire. Imagine standing at the prow of a late 15th century caravel as the coastline of Europe thins into a hard, bright line, and the unknown stretches ahead like a dark sea of promise. The Portuguese had been standing at that prow for decades, peering past sight lines that had bound other peoples for centuries. Their urge to push beyond the familiar was born of need and opportunity at once, a desire to find new routes to spices, gold, and allies, and the stubborn curiosity of sailors who learned to read winds the way others read scripture. This was not an accidental ascent. It was a deliberate, state-backed project that reshaped the map and the fate of continents. In the courts of Lisbon and in the workshops by the river, a small kingdom had assembled the instruments of maritime power. Prince Henry, later known as the Navigator, was not a navigator in name alone but an organizer of voyages, a patron who funded the slow accumulation of knowledge about currents, celestial navigation, and ship design. He sent pilots south along the African coast, probing, trading, and mapping, until the Atlantic no longer felt like a sudden abyss but like a place with edges and patterns. Shipbuilders learned to balance cargo, speed, and seaworthiness, and sailors learned to trust charts and astrolabes that translated the sky into direction. The technology mattered, and yet so did the institutions that turned single voyages into a sustained empire. The Crown collected intelligence meticulously and rewarded initiative selectively. It established the Casa de India, a body that managed licenses, monopolies, and the complex flows of goods that streamed from Asia and Africa into Portugal. There was a rhythm to it. A fleet would leave with royal approval, travel the return route with treasure and spices, and yet each voyage was embedded in a larger logistics network that included insurers, merchants, and distant governors. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut in 1498, the Portuguese had bridged the Old World and the new Asian opportunities by sea in a way that undermined centuries of overland routes. The arrival was violent and extraordinary at once. The Portuguese sought to join established networks of trade, but they also tried to impose new terms through armed force. They built fortified stations along the East African coast, at Hormuz, and at strategic points in India, using firepower to secure choke points that turned global flows into regulated conduits. These forts were not mere outposts, they were engines of control, where local rulers, merchants, and sailors negotiated the price of access to distant markets. The empire grew along lines that mixed trade and territorial control, and it worked differently in each place. On the coasts of West Africa, men exchanged gold and slaves at trading posts, while in East Africa and the Arabian Sea the Portuguese tried to insert themselves into long-distance networks dominated by Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants. Their triumphs were uneven. At Goa they built a capital of the Estado de India, a hub of administration and commerce where languages braided together, where Christian churches faced Hindu temples, and where spices choked the air. The empire depended less on vast contiguous land and more on nodal points and maritime highways, and that made its reach both nimble and precarious. Trade was the heart of this empire and the artery through which power flowed. Spices were the most celebrated commodity, but gold, ivory, textiles, timber, and eventually sugar and tobacco from the Atlantic islands and the Americas would also drive economic decisions. Portuguese ships carried precious cargoes to Lisbon where markets consumed the taste of the wider world. The effect on European consumers was immediate and profound. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg changed cooking, medicine, and culture, and they made the Portuguese crown far richer than its modest territory might have suggested. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 carved up newly discovered lands between Portugal and Spain along a meridian the two crowns agreed to respect, creating a legal framework that gave Portugal the right to much of the Atlantic and a room to the east that included Africa and Asia. It was a diplomatic stroke that anticipated centuries of rivalry and realpolitik. The map became an instrument of sovereignty, and the law of the sea was translated into lines on parchment that merchants and monarchs would consult when fortunes and lives were at stake. Yet maps were only as good as the ships that enforced them and the men who read them. Portugal's early understanding of winds and currents was a practical form of knowledge that transformed the Atlantic into attained space. The trade winds, the volta do mar, and the knowledge of seasonal monsoons had been gathered through experience, through loss and success, and through a willingness to systematize what had once seemed capricious. The volta do mar, the return by the open ocean where pilots trusted the westward drift to bring ships home, allowed for regular movements across wide distances. It turned voyages into predictable circuits, and predictability is the lifeblood of trade. Sailing these circuits produced human stories of courage and cruelty. Sailors faced scurvy, storms, and the slow erosion of hope on long voyages. At the same time, they encountered strangers whose lives had known other rhythms and certainties. In ports like Funchal, Santiago, Mombasa, or Malaccas, languages mixed, and so did foodways, religions, and practices. Creolized societies began to form around Emporia, as men and women from Europe, Africa, Asia, and indigenous America shared boats, beds, and business, creating hybrid cultures that outlived many of the initial trading regimes. The Portuguese role in the Atlantic world was uniquely early and influential. They established sugar plantations on Madeira and later in the islands of the Atlantic, recruiting labor and developing techniques that would replicate in Brazil and the Caribbean with catastrophic consequences. Sugar was a plantation crop that demanded capital, organized labor, and ruthless management. It created a template for the plantation economy that would become the hallmark of European colonial agriculture in the tropics, and it relied on coerced labor systems that had long-term moral and demographic consequences. Brazil, claimed for Portugal after Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet made landfall in 1500, would become the crown jewel of the Portuguese Atlantic. Its coast offered timber and dyes at first, but the arrival of sugar transformed its economic geography. Plantations proliferated, cities like Salvador and Recife took shape around docks and processing mills, and the transatlantic slave trade began to fill a brutal demand for labor. The Portuguese in Brazil created a social order stratified by race, wealth, and access to land, and they connected the Americas with Europe and Africa in a triangular economy that remade lives on 3 continents. This triangular trade would become integral to the rise of the Atlantic world, a network of exchange that bound Africa, Europe, and the Americas through goods, people, and capital. Commodities moved in one direction and labor in another, while silver from Spanish America would cross the Atlantic to reach European markets and then flow eastward to Asia. Portuguese ports served as gateways in these movements, reconfiguring fiscal flows and sparking price changes across markets. The rise in money supply and the diffusion of imported goods contributed to what historians call the consumer revolution in Europe, altering patterns of consumption and prompting new financial instruments. The Casa de India managed many of these complexities, controlling licenses, assigning cargoes, and collecting customs duties that enriched the crown but not always the merchants. The Portuguese monarchy used monopolies to extract rents, but monopolies breed smuggling and corruption, and the Casa eventually had to contend with undercutting and evasion. Meanwhile, private merchants and foreign partners learned to navigate around royal structures, creating networks that were both dependent on and independent of imperial control. This tension between crown monopoly and private enterprise defined much of the empire's economic character. Forts and fortified trading posts were both symbols and tools of Portuguese power. They dotted the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the African coastline, each one a small city with its own garrison, warehouses, and chapels. These structures asserted Portuguese presence but also created interactions with local polities that were often more pragmatic than ideological. Local rulers were willing to partner when profit demanded and to resist when foreign control threatened sovereignty, so Portuguese officials learned to mix diplomacy and coercion, gifts and guns. The human cost of empire, however, was immense and often obscured by stories of exotic spices and bold captains. The transatlantic slave trade, in which Portuguese traders were early and persistent participants, devastated African communities through raids, wars, and population displacements. Once in the Americas, enslaved laborers endured backbreaking work, violent punishment, and the erasure of family and cultural ties. The economic bounty of the empire rested on the suffering of millions, and that suffering reshaped demographics, societies, and moral frameworks across continents. Religion and missionizing were intertwined with commercial goals, and conversion became both an instrument of soft power and a source of controversy. Jesuit missionaries established schools, catechized indigenous populations, and sometimes acted as intermediaries between the crown and local communities. The Portuguese used the language of Christian duty to justify colonial presence, but conversion was rarely a simple process. Indigenous and African peoples negotiated their spiritual worlds with new doctrines, integrating, resisting, and transforming Christianity in ways that left enduring cultural traces. Language and culture traveled along the same routes as goods and people. Portuguese became a lingua franca in parts of Africa and Asia, a vehicle for trade and administration, but it also mixed with local tongues to produce creoles and hybrid dialects. Music, cuisine, and sartorial tastes migrated too. The sting of pepper and the sweetness of sugar found new homes in distant kitchens, while African rhythms and instruments entered liturgies and festivals. This intangible cultural exchange outlived political control and contributed to the long shadow of the Portuguese language and culture in many parts of the world. Cartography and knowledge production were central to imperial project. Maps were produced not only to navigate but to claim. Portuguese cartographers compiled information from pilots, traders, and spies, constructing maps that combined empirical observation with imaginative filling in of blank spaces. These maps were prized commodities, diplomatic tools, and educational resources. They also carried ambiguities and errors that sometimes led to conflict, but they gradually transformed the mental landscape of Europe, making oceans legible and the world seem manageable. Navigation was a craft and a science, and the instruments of navigation were prized as instruments of power. Astrolabes, compasses, crossstaffs, and later the backstaff were technological breakthroughs that taught mariners to measure latitude and estimate position. Pilot books contained routes and practical wisdom that could mean the difference between life and death, and learned men gathered in workshops and courts to debate and refine techniques. The Portuguese state supported these efforts because knowledge at sea translated directly into advantage in trade and war. Naval warfare also shaped the empire, with ships equipped to fight on the high seas and from fortresses along the coast. The heavily armed carracks and naus could dominate merchant fleets that lacked artillery, and the Portuguese used this advantage to enforce monopolies and to protect convoys. Yet the same seas that made them powerful also brought rivals. The Dutch, the English, and the French challenged Portuguese supremacy in the 17th century, developing naval tactics and commercial networks that eroded Portuguese dominance. These contests were not only military but economic, and the cumulative effect was a gradual intensification of competition and global trade. Decline did not come quickly nor from a single cause. The empire was vast but thinly staffed, its resources strained by wars in Europe and the need to defend far-flung posts. Successive waves of adversaries chipped away at the Portuguese network, taking strategic ports and diverting trade flows. The Dutch captured key spice islands and disrupted the East Indies trade, while English and French merchants found new markets and partners. Beyond direct competition, systemic issues such as a limited domestic economy, fiscal pressures, and the Crown's fiscal mismanagement undermined long-term resilience. Yet decline was not only failure, it was also transformation. Portuguese merchants adapted, shifting focus from monopolistic control to participation in wider, more open markets. The patterns of exchange evolved, and the Atlantic axis grew in importance as the Americas became an ever more central theater for labor and extraction. The Portuguese Empire reoriented itself in some respects toward Brazil and the Atlantic trade, and it struck bargains with other European powers to keep parts of its network viable. The result was an empire that changed shape rather than simply collapsing overnight. The economic consequences in Europe were profound and sometimes paradoxical. The influx of exotic goods and precious metals spurred consumption and investment but also contributed to inflation and shifts in economic power. Cities like Lisbon became nodes of new wealth, but the distribution was uneven. Elites prospered while many commoners saw only subtle changes in daily life. The circulation of bullion also shifted balances with Asia, where silver was prized and where Portuguese merchants negotiated complicated exchanges between European demand and Asian supply. African societies were transformed in myriad ways by the Portuguese presence. Coastal kingdoms engaged in trade with European partners to obtain cloth, firearms, and prestige goods. But participation in the slave trade often intensified internal conflicts and redirected social energies towards capturing captives for export. The inland dynamics changed as coastal powers gained influence and as European goods altered consumption patterns. In some regions, Portuguese intermarriage and cultural exchange produced Afro-Portuguese communities whose identities reflected creolization and adaptation. In Asia, the Portuguese model of limited territorial control and maritime dominance proved effective for a time. Their capture of strategic ports like Malacca, Goa, and Hormuz allowed them to levy duties and control traffic through choke points. Yet Asian empires such as the Ottoman, Mughal, and Ming states had their own resources and sometimes resisted Portuguese encroachment. In many places, commerce continued under older networks in which the Portuguese were one participant among many, and local merchants and rulers were adept at playing different European powers against each other. The culture of the army and navy reflected both martial values and a unique cosmopolitanism. Soldiers, sailors, pilots, and administrators came from diverse backgrounds and met people from many lands, bringing back goods, stories, and practices. Their letters and logs were a primary source of knowledge about far places and peoples, and they often conveyed ambivalent attitudes, oscillating between admiration, contempt, curiosity, and greed. These human narratives formed a complex archive of empire that survives in administrative documents, personal journals, and the literature of the time. Religion shaped politics as well as personal conviction, and ecclesiastical authorities sometimes conflicted with commercial priorities. The padroado, the system that gave the Portuguese crown influence over the appointment of bishops in distant territories, intertwined secular and spiritual governance. The Jesuits became prominent in education and conversion efforts, creating schools that taught European values and skills. But missionary work could also clash with commerce when conversion threatened established hierarchies. In many places, Christian communities developed distinctive local flavors, incorporating indigenous rituals and aesthetics. The material culture of the empire was as distinctive as its maps. Azulejos, lacquerware, carved ivory, and porcelain moved across oceans, influencing tastes in Europe and creating new artistic dialogues. In cities like Goa, Lisbon, and Salvador, households displayed objects that told stories of trade and conquest, signaling wealth and cosmopolitanism. Artisans adapted foreign techniques to local materials and tastes, and the resulting hybrid arts revealed the give-and-take of colonial encounters. Legal frameworks attempted to structure imperial life, regulating everything from trade to marriage to colonial governance. The Portuguese developed elaborate ordinances and codes to administer distant territories, while local courts often mediated disputes involving Europeans and indigenous peoples. Laws could be instruments of control and of negotiation, and the reality of enforcement was always contingent on local conditions. That tension reveals the improvisational nature of empire. Rules existed, but so did 1,000 ways to get around them. Trade networks fostered financial innovation as well. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and partnerships spread risk and allowed merchants to operate across oceans without transferring large sums in coin. Insurance emerged to mitigate the peril of storms and piracy, and credit networks connected Lisbon to Antwerp, Seville, and ports in Asia. These financial arrangements knitted together diverse economies and made transoceanic trade both viable and systemic, even as they introduced new vulnerabilities to credit crises and wartime disruptions. Piracy and privateering were persistent threats and sometimes tools of state policy. When Portugal faced enemies it lacked the resources to confront directly, it could license privateers to prey on rival shipping, turning maritime violence into a semi-official instrument of competition. These practices blurred the lines between legitimate war and criminality, and they added a volatile element to already risky voyages. At the same time, piracy sometimes arose from local grievances and opportunism, reflecting the precariousness of coastal economies dependent on imperial trade. Everyday life in Portuguese towns and ports revealed the human side of global exchange. Markets were cosmopolitan, filled with goods from distant lands and people speaking many tongues, while taverns and inns were places where news and rumor traveled as fast as spices. Women played important roles in households and in urban economies, managing domestic production and sometimes even participating in trade networks. The rhythms of work and worship, of market days and festivals, persisted even as colonial connections altered material possibilities and social status. Foodways tell a particular story of exchange. Ingredients that seemed exotic in Portugal became ordinary in colonial settings, and vice versa. Cassava, maize, and chili peppers arrived in Africa and Asia from the Americas, transforming diets and agricultural systems. Likewise, Old World wheat and cattle adapted in new climates, and culinary practices hybridized, making a living map of human movement. These changes in what people ate had deep implications for health, agriculture, and local economies. Demography was dramatically reshaped by the movements the Portuguese helped catalyze. Populations in the Americas fell due to disease and conquest, African regions experienced the trauma of the slave trade, and European cities grew as trade drew wealth and migrants. These demographic shifts had political consequences, reshaping labor systems, electoral politics, and social hierarchies. In turn, demographic pressures influenced migration patterns and the development of colonial policies aimed at settlement and labor control. Education and learning were avenues through which ideas spread and adapted. Missionary schools taught reading and catechism, while courtly patronage supported scholars who compiled natural histories and travel accounts. Portuguese chronicles, often written by clerics and officials, recorded observations of flora, fauna, and people, producing a patchwork of knowledge that informed European understanding of the world. This process of documenting and classifying laid groundwork for later scientific inquiry, even as it was colored by the biases and priorities of empire. Networks of espionage and diplomacy underpinned much of the empire's success. Information about sea routes, foreign markets, and political alliances was a strategic asset that the Portuguese cultivated deliberately. Secret letters, coded messages, and diplomatic gifts were part of a world where knowledge could save lives and open markets. Couriers and resident agents were therefore as important as soldiers and sailors in projecting power. The built environment of the empire reflected both adaptation and assertion. Fortresses, churches, administrative palaces, and trading warehouses were constructed in diverse styles that combined local techniques with European forms. In many colonial cities, urban planning reflected priorities of defense and trade, with ports and forts placed to control maritime approaches. The aesthetics of these cities mediated between local realities and imperial ideals, producing built landscapes that were at once functional and symbolic. The Portuguese legal doctrine of discovery and possession underwrote many claims to land, but implementation depended on local alliances, missionary presence, and military force. Land grants and captaincies distributed responsibility for colonization sometimes to private individuals who bore the costs and risks of settlement. Some of these grants prospered while others failed, and the variation across regions illustrates the fragility of transplanting European institutions into new ecological and social environments. Military campaigns sometimes served to secure trade, and vice versa. Combat in coastal regions aimed at eliminating rivals, suppressing pirates, or punishing resistant rulers. Campaigns were expensive and risky, and the crown often struggled to supply adequate forces at distance. In many instances, alliances with local powers were preferable to outright conquest, producing hybrid sovereignties in which Portuguese rule was a negotiated reality rather than an absolute fact. The empire also had a bureaucratic side that few travelers saw: clerks, scribes, and accountants who tracked cargoes, taxes, and legal disputes. These administrators formed the gears that kept the machinery running, translating maritime events into ledgers and reports that informed policy. The bureaucratic culture taught efficiency, record-keeping, and a certain mindset of control, even as local improvisations often diverged from official policy. This administrative infrastructure was a silent but essential dimension of imperial power. Environmental consequences of colonial practices became visible over time. Deforestation for shipbuilding and for sugar plantations altered landscapes, while monoculture agriculture exhausted soils and reshaped local ecologies. The introduction of non-native species changed the balances of pest and predator, with profound effects on agriculture and health. These ecological changes were often irreversible and had cascading effects on local subsistence patterns and economies. Art and literature produced during the era both celebrated and questioned the imperial project. Chronicles, poetry, and drama drew on the romance of discovery and the brutality of conquest, creating narratives that justified empire even as some works questioned its moral costs. Travel writing and romance fiction fed European imaginations about distant lands, sometimes flattening complex societies into exotic backdrops while also sparking debate about governance and ethics. Cultural production thus both reflected and shaped perceptions of the wider world. Maritime law evolved alongside practice, as notions of free passage, territorial waters, and the rights of belligerents were contended. Treaties, court cases, and international negotiations sought to regulate behavior at sea even as piracy and private warfare complicated matters. Portugal participated in the development of a legal environment that would later global powers draw upon and expand, making the seas not only sites of violence but also subjects of legal reasoning. Science benefited from imperial encounters as naturalists and physicians encountered new plants, medicines, and diseases. Botanical specimens and exotic substances found their way into European collections and apothecaries, expanding knowledge of pharmacology and agriculture. At the same time, disease spread was a tragic and often overlooked consequence of contact, decimating populations unaccustomed to new pathogens and reshuffling labor and social orders. The Portuguese language itself became a vessel for new words and concepts drawn from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Loanwords for food, tools, and cultural practices enriched Portuguese vocabulary, while the language served as a medium for administration and conversion across continents. Linguistic exchange was another dimension of empire that created long-lasting bonds, visible in modern Lusophone nations where Portuguese remains spoken in ways tinged by local grammar and sensibility. Military technology transferred in both directions, with European firearms changing warfare in parts of Africa and Asia while local technologies, tactics, and shipbuilding techniques influenced Portuguese practice. The exchange of knowledge on fortifications, navigation, and ship design was iterative, and the Portuguese learned from their rivals and partners. This technological conversation accelerated the pace of change across the seas and contributed to the global diffusion of military innovation. Economically, the empire's revenues waxed and waned with the fortunes of trade and the crown's accounting. At times, the influx of resources funded palaces, religious endowments, and art. At other times, it failed to cover the costs of defense and administration. Fiscal instability was a chronic problem, leading to regressive measures like selling offices and granting monopolies that had long-term distorting effects. The interplay of short-term wealth and long-term liability characterized much of Portugal's imperial experience. The social history of colonial elites reveals a blend of ambition and anxiety. Landowners, merchants, and officials sought to reproduce European status markers in colonial contexts, building networks of patronage, marriage, and religious piety. Yet these elites often had to negotiate with indigenous norms and local economic realities, producing a hybrid aristocracy that was at once proud of its metropolitan ties and pragmatic about colonial exigencies. Their fortunes could rise quickly on a plume of luck or crash under the weight of debt and disease. As competitors gained strength, Portuguese diplomacy shifted toward accommodation in some regions and covert assertion in others. Alliances with local rulers, marriage ties, and diplomatic patronage were tools used as often as cannons. This diplomatic repertoire widened the empire's options but also exposed it to the vagaries of local politics. The capacity to broker agreements was sometimes more effective than outright conquest in maintaining long-term presence. The rise of modern statecraft owes something to the Portuguese experience in administrating a widely dispersed set of territories. Techniques of revenue collection, maritime logistics, and overseas governance developed into models other states adapted. Portugal's experience taught European monarchs important lessons about imperial overstretch, the importance of local alliances, and the economic uses and limits of monopoly. These lessons had consequences for the later rise of empires on a larger scale. Religious syncretism produced unique cultural landscapes, where saints resembled local spirits and rituals fused Christian and indigenous practices. Black and indigenous devotions took on forms that would be unrecognizable to a strictly European observer, and these practices persisted to become distinctive religious traditions in the Atlantic world. The resulting spiritual tapestry was a testament to human resilience and adaptability under conditions of coercion and exchange. Architectural legacies remain visible in ports, churches, and administrative buildings scattered across continents. In many cities, the Baroque facades of churches sit beside bazaars and markets, and these structures narrate a history of trade, faith, and governance. Restoration projects and urban archaeology continue to reveal the layers of occupation and adaptation, showing how architecture can be a living archive of contact and conflict. The environmental and demographic consequences also included urban epidemics and changes in settlement patterns. Cities concentrated people and goods, but also disease vectors, and outbreaks could cause dramatic mortality and economic disruption. Urban planning sometimes responded by rethinking sanitation and fortification, but the unpredictability of disease remained a persistent hazard. Epidemics reshaped labor pools and sometimes altered the course of economic activities, revealing the fragility of the human networks that sustained empire. Science and medicine evolved through encounter and adaptation, with surgeons and physicians learning new treatments and encountering new illnesses. Portuguese surgeons wrote manuals on tropical diseases and wound treatment that circulated among seamen and colonial doctors. These practical medical insights contributed to the slow improvement of care for seafarers and colonists, even as medical knowledge remained limited by the era's understanding. Cultural artifacts, from manuscripts to objects, provide historians with windows into the everyday and the extraordinary. Letters from captains, ledgers of merchants, and missionary reports paint a textured picture of the choices and compromises of life under empire. Museums and archives now hold these materials, and their study continues to refine our understanding of the multiple Portuguese worlds that existed across continents. These artifacts remind us that empire was never a single story but a mosaic of experiences and consequences. The Portuguese Empire's long-term legacy is complicated and ambivalent. On one hand, it was an engine of globalization, pioneering sea routes and creating exchanges that knit continents together in durable ways. On the other hand, it initiated patterns of exploitation, forced migration, and ecological change that caused deep suffering and reconfigured societies in often painful ways. The story is both a tale of human ingenuity and a cautionary lesson about power, and it invites ongoing reflection on how worlds are made and remade. In the end, the Golden Empire was less a static thing than a process in motion, a shifting aggregation of forts, ports, plantations, and communities linked by ships and ledgers. Its golden sheen derived from material wealth and from the glow of possibility on the horizon, but beneath that gleam lay labor, restraint, and conflict. The rise of the Atlantic world owed much to Portuguese initiative, and the currents they learned to ride continued to carry people, goods, and ideas long after the empire's political primacy faded. Listening now, if you picture those ships moving across a dark ocean under a sky of stars, you can trace the sinews of an age in which the globe shrank and interconnected in ways difficult to overstate. The Portuguese experiments in navigation, trade, and governance set patterns that others would expand and contest, catalyzing the deep economic and social transformations of the early modern period. What began as a quest for spices and routes became a complex civilization of exchange whose reverberations still shape languages, economies, and cultures around the world. Even as the empire waned in power, Portuguese influence remained resilient in surprising ways, and the languages people spoke, the foods they cooked, the legal forms that survived, and the architectural footprints that endure. Places as varied as Goa, Luanda, and Recife still bear marks of that centuries-long encounter in stone, tongue, and custom. The Atlantic world that rose in these centuries was not simply a product of conquest but also of negotiation, improvisation, and creativity among peoples who met and remade one another. Historians and listeners who care to look closely find that the Portuguese story forces us to confront complex ethical questions about trade, domination, and cultural exchange. It complicates the narratives of progress by showing how interconnectedness often entails exploitation. At the same time, it reveals human capacities for adaptation, invention, and aesthetic fusion that transcend borders and persist beyond the lives of kings and merchants. The Golden Empire, then, is less an object than a set of relationships spread across oceanic space, a constellation of actors who traded, fought, loved, and believed in distant places. The currents of that age carried treasures and grievances together, and their legacy is a world where local lives were forever altered by global movements. To listen to this history is to hear the creak of timbers and the murmur of markets, to smell spices and sawdust, and to imagine the countless ordinary moments that made up an extraordinary transformation. We can conclude no moral summation without recognizing the human toll alongside the technical brilliance, yet neither should we reduce the Portuguese legacy to a single emotion of condemnation or praise. History is threaded with ambiguities, and the story of Portugal's maritime empire is no different. It is a tale of daring navigation and cruel commerce, of cultural flowering and social destruction. The challenge for us now is to hold both truths at once and to learn from the complexity of an age that helped shape the modern world. The story begins with wind and sea, with squalls that split the horizon and the hard salt taste of the Atlantic on the lips of men who believed the world could be circled. Portugal learned to read storms before it read maps, learning which currents could be trusted, which trade winds would carry a caravel to the Azores, and which dark swell warned of shoals and shoals of danger. Under that weather, the first Portuguese captains became craftsmen of navigation, harnessing astronomical lines and learned guesses to cross vast emptiness and return with tales of spices and gold. Their success was not accidental but born of a discipline that turned seamanship into empire and storms into a kind of grammar for expansion. The Portuguese Empire rose in an age when small ships could uproot old certainties and open new ones. It began on the Atlantic littoral, with Prince Henry the Navigator planting a program of exploration along the coast of Africa that blurred the line between curiosity and commerce. He commissioned pilots and instrument makers, funded voyages for the presumed sake of piety and power, and in doing so set in motion a web of fortresses and factors that would stretch from Brazil to Japan. What followed was not only conquest but a new global rhythm in which the movement of a single Portuguese carrack could alter markets and shift the fortunes of nations. Vasco da Gama's passage to India in 1498 was a stormless pivot in geopolitical imagination. It proved the sea route that bypassed Arabian middlemen and put the spicy heart of Asia within reach of Lisbon's merchants. The route changed more than trade prices. It marked the beginning of a Portuguese strategy that placed fortified trading posts and heavily armed carracks at choke points. From Ceuta to Hormuz, Goa to Malacca, a constellation of castles and warehouses, chapels, and corruptible officials testified to an empire that preferred trade secured by force to territorial assimilation. Those nodes were both shields and shadows, bright with gold and dark with the human costs of dominion. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese met civilizations that were old, commercial, and resilient, and they met different kinds of resistance than the nomadic wars of Europe. They fought with local rulers, allied with some, antagonized others, and filled the sea lanes with privately owned galleons that doubled as warships. Rivalries with the Mamluks and then the Ottoman Empire made the ocean a theater for gunpowder and diplomacy, reducing bazaars and ports to bargaining chips in a larger contest for supremacy. The Portuguese model was compact and brutal: take the island, impose a monopoly, burn spice trees when control began to slip, and prune any rival who tried to undercut prices. The Southeast Asian spices, cloves, nutmeg, mace, were so valuable that they were worth the fires set to entire plantations. The tiny Banda Islands, for example, are an emblem of how far the empire would go to sustain a trade monopoly. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch, treated the islands as both bullion and battlefield, and for local populations the coming of Europeans canceled centuries of local sovereignty in a single violent motion. The empire's reliance on annihilation as a policy in these arcs of the globe cast long, persistent shadows that would return in later revolts and memory. Portugal's Atlantic ventures folded into a different universe when a vast and verdant land opened to European settlers in 1500. Brazil, claimed for the crown after Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet saw a wooded coastline. Brazil's wealth would not be discovered all at once. It followed the slow, profitable choreography of sugar, cattle, and later, gold. Plantations concentrated wealth and power in narrow hands and created an economy dependent on coerced labor, on the forced importation of African slaves, and on an ideology that turned land into commodity and people into capital. The plantations reshaped the landscape, sugar mills and ingon hoes, and reshaped social relations, producing a colonial society of masters, overseers, indentured laborers, and those who resisted or fled. Resistance took many forms and earned many names, but one of the earliest and most vivid was the Maroon communities, groups of escaped slaves who established autonomous settlements deep in inhospitable places. Those communities were more than hiding places; they were political acts, living experiments in freedom and governance that threatened plantation owners because they offered hope and a model. Quilombo dos Palmares in Brazil became legendary, a confederation of settlements that for decades resisted Portuguese and local slaveholder incursions before being starved out by sustained military campaigns. Palmarians embodied a stubborn refusal that would recur throughout the empire. Autonomy insisted upon by the colonized was a coastal wind pushing against the empire's brittle sails. In Africa, the Portuguese pattern took the form of coastal forts and a complex system of alliances with local kings and intermediaries who profited from European goods in exchange for captives. Along the West African coasts, forts at Elmina and later Luanda were nodes in an Atlantic circuit that supplied labor for the Americas and sustained European luxurious habits. But this was a two-way street in violence. African polities sometimes weaponized the demand for slaves to settle scores or expand power, and the Portuguese, in turn, sought to manipulate that appetite to reinforce their own dominion. Over time, these relations fossilized into mixed societies of Mesticos and Afro-Portuguese elites who mediated between metropole and hinterland, and whose loyalties were often as fluid as the tides. The spice trade drew other predators. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, arrived as a corporate leviathan with warships and shareholder capital, and it systematically displaced Portuguese influence in many places. Dutch military and mercantile efficiency probed Portuguese overextension and exploited administrative weaknesses, capturing strategic posts across the Indian Ocean archipelagos and establishing a stranglehold on the trade of nutmeg and cloves. The loss of these richly profitable islands undermined Lisbon's calculations and revealed the fragility of an empire that relied on far-flung garrisons held together by honor, faith, and slow communications. English and French competitors made similar inroads, capitalizing on naval improvements and mercantile innovation. The English East India Company and later the British naval machine eroded Portuguese claims through better logistics, greater capital reserves, and the ability to project force in ways Lisbon's smaller crown could not match. ports that once bowed to Lisbon's letters of marque now flirted with new protections, new trade deals, and the rarely lucrative neutrality of playing empires off one another. The Portuguese, always ingenious, sometimes adapted by cultivating local alliances and by reinventing commercial tactics, but adaptation has limits, and in the long sweep of economic warfare Portugal was often outmatched. At home, the empire's expansion created tensions that seemed to pull Lisbon in multiple directions. There were debates about revenue, the costs of garrisoning far-flung posts, and the morality and profitability of dependency upon slavery. Merchants in Lisbon prospered while many in the rural interior or in newly enriched colonial shops chafed under an archaic system of monopolies and customs. The court's occasional reforms, designed to bolster imperial revenue and centralize control, often produced backlash that sowed the seeds of political instability and intellectual ferment among a growing literate class. One of the most dramatic internal reckonings came in the 18th century when Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal, rose to prominence after the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Pombal shaped an agenda of modernization that was as authoritarian as it was thorough, reorganizing colonial administration, curtailing the power of the nobility, expelling the Jesuits, and pushing economic reforms that aimed to wring more profit from empire. His policies strengthened imperial control in some quarters but also destabilized older balances, provoking resistance among clerical powers and colonial elites who resented bureaucratic encroachment. Pombal's legacy was paradoxical. He made the state more efficient and more brittle, more modern and more prone to revolt when its subjects felt squeezed. The Atlantic and Indian empires were never uniform. They were patchworks of overlapping sovereignties, intermediaries, and competing laws. In Goa and Macau, Portuguese authorities negotiated with local societies in ways that created hybrid Creole cultures, with language blending, culinary exchange, and religious syncretism. Catholic missions in Goa and Brazil sought conversions that were sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic, and always suffused with the tension between spiritual aspiration and material control. Churches anchored colonial towns, but the souls within them could be as defiant as the flotsam along the shore, and faith sometimes proved an instrument of resistance rather than submission. Economically, the Portuguese Empire benefited from early monopolies but struggled with the modernizing pressures of industrial Europe. As the British and the French industrialized, they opened markets and demanded raw materials while supplying manufactured goods that undercut local craft. The abolitionist movements and eventual abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century, first in stages and under great external pressure, fractured the labor foundations of plantation economies. Some colonists adapted by importing wage laborers from other parts of the world or by shifting crop patterns, but the transition was painful and contested, producing social dislocation and further fermenting independence movements. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe provided a strange, storm-driven twist that both sustained and eroded the empire. When Napoleon's armies rolled into the Iberian Peninsula, the royal family fled to Brazil in 1807, making Rio de Janeiro a temporary imperial capital. This relocation elevated Brazil from colonial backwater to heart of the empire, opening ports, promoting commerce, and creating a new bureaucratic center. Yet the presence of the court in America also accelerated the independence that came to define the 19th century, for with power shifted across the ocean, colonial elites tasted sovereignty and the appetite for self-rule grew. The return of Dom João VI to Portugal and the decision of his son Pedro to remain in Brazil set the stage for a rupture that was both constitutional and personal. In 1822, Pedro declared Brazil's independence, a move complicated by dynastic ties that produced a relatively bloodless but decisive separation. The Portuguese crown's willingness to accept this loss, under negotiation and pressure, signified the beginning of the imperial contraction that would continue for a century and a half. Brazil's independence was not simply a political moment, it was a reshaping of Atlantic systems of trade, alliance, and identity. Meanwhile, elsewhere the shadow wars continued. In India, Portuguese Goa held out as an enclave of European influence, but its relevance slowly diminished as British India expanded and as the Portuguese struggled to maintain effective rule amid rising Indian nationalism. Macau remained an uneasy outpost, a place where Chinese sovereignty and Portuguese administration braided into a tenuous cohabitation. These Asian footholds persisted longer than many expected, kept alive by habit, trade niches, and diplomatic quirks. Yet their days were numbered in the era of high nationalism and anti-colonial agitation that would follow World War II. The 19th century was a century of humiliations and of attempts at salvage. Portugal endured an 1890 British ultimatum that forced it to withdraw from ambitious African territorial claims, often called the Pink Map, a humiliation that inflamed public opinion and helped cause the fall of the monarchy in 1910. That crisis revealed the imbalance between imperial aspiration and metropolitan capacity. Small states could claim empires, but maintaining them against stronger rivals required more resources than Lisbon could muster. The loss of prestige, alongside internal political crisis, fed a national identity crisis whose consequences were felt for generations. Colonial rule in Africa evolved under distinct pressures with the advent of the Scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference. Portugal, though small, claimed vast stretches of territory, Angola to the west and Mozambique to the east, seeking to knit them into an Atlantic to Indian corridor. Boundaries were often amorphous and enforced by local treaties, gunboats, or paternalistic claims that ignored indigenous polities. To administer and profit from these territories, Portugal relied on private companies, concessionary regimes, and forced labor systems that stoked resentments and incubated the very nationalist movements that would later topple colonial rule. Slavery's abolition in Portuguese colonies was a protracted process that left deep marks. While the slave trade was outlawed in stages during the 19th century, the structures of coerced labor persisted in new forms: contract labor, forced apprenticeships, and other practices that replicated bondage under different names. These continuities made emancipation incomplete and often superficial. Freed people remained economically dependent and politically marginalized, and the seedbeds of revolt remained fertile. Across Africa and Brazil, the memory of slavery and the persistence of inequality contributed to revolutionary consciousness when organizing became possible. Catalysts of independence often combined local grievances with global ideologies. Nationalism, anti-colonial thought, and Marxist ideas mingled with traditional claims to autonomy and leadership. Figures like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and Eduardo Mondlane and Samora Machel in Mozambique, articulated a synthesis that drew on rural networks, the memory of historical resistance, and the practical necessities of guerrilla warfare. These leaders exposed the weaknesses of metropolitan control and gave insurgencies a political and social coherence that made them difficult to suppress. The mid-20th century decolonization wave accelerated under the pressures of post-war anti-imperialism and changing international norms. Portugal's Estado Novo regime, an authoritarian government under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, refused to accept the contagion of decolonization, insisting instead on a doctrine of overseas provinces and integration. That refusal turned colonial wars in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique into protracted bloodletting, where guerrilla tactics met increasingly brutal counterinsurgency and where Cold War dynamics funneled arms, advisors, and ideological stakes into local fights. Guinea-Bissau's path to independence under the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, PAIG, was emblematic, a disciplined revolutionary organization that combined military insurgency with political work among peasants, teachers, and local leaders. The Paik's victories in rural areas revealed the limitations of Portuguese military power, especially when faced with terrain, disease, and popular mobilization. International sympathy and logistical support from sympathetic states widened the gulf between metropolitan endurance and colonial viability, ultimately making independence an inescapable outcome in an exhausted Lisbon. Mozambique's war was different in geography and management but similar in its toll. Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, fought a long guerrilla campaign that capitalized on Portugal's stretched resources and the impossibility of winning hearts and minds with repression alone. Mozambique's struggle fused rural mobilization with a vision of post-colonial social rearrangement, and as in Guinea, it revealed how costly imperial control had become in the nuclear shadow of the Cold War. The human price was immense, and the social fabric of many towns and villages was torn by violence, displacement, and suspicion. Angola's conflict became, in some ways, the most entangled. Multiple movements, the MPLA, UNITA, and the FNLA, contested both colonial rule and one another, with ethnic, ideological, and external patronage lines complicating the struggle. After independence in 1975, Angola descended into a civil war that lasted decades, fueled by foreign support and Cold War stakes. The long conflict demonstrated how decolonization often yielded not immediate peace but new forms of warfare shaped by the leftover economic structures and rivalries of empire. The Carnation Revolution of 1974 in Portugal was a sudden gust that toppled an entrenched regime. Soldiers, disillusioned by years of colonial conflict and inspired by a desire for democratic reform, marched and met minimal resistance, placing carnations in gun muzzles as a symbol of the peaceful uprising. The revolution unraveled not only an authoritarian domestic regime but also the last papery threads of colonialism, prompting rapid negotiations and the flurry of independence declarations that marked 1975. That sudden collapse was both a liberation and a chaos. New states emerged with immediate sovereignty but without stable institutions, and the aftermath was a scramble to define nationhood amid economic ruin and refugee flows. As colonies became nations, the legacy of Portuguese rule, legal codes, language, ecclesiastical structures, and hybrid elites persisted in complex ways. In some places, Portuguese became a unifying lingua franca. In others, Lusophone communities were riven by caste-like separations and patrimonial politics. New leaderships often inherited colonial bureaucracies and had to decide whether to repurpose them, dismantle them, or try to build something else. Those choices shaped trajectories. Some countries leaned toward socialism and state planning, others toward mixed economies, but nearly all struggled with the dearth of trained administrators and the acute needs of reconstruction. In Brazil, independence produced a long, uneven path to stable nationhood, with empire, republic, and eventually an industrializing society that retained deep inequalities. The plantation economy survived in different guises, and the cultural imprint of Portugal, language, Catholic rituals, legal traditions, remained strong. Brazil's own internal revolts, regionalisms, and experiments with slavery's end shaped a country that both belonged to and diverged from its colonial parent. Its size and resources allowed it to become a new center in the Portuguese-speaking world even as it distanced itself politically and culturally from Lisbon. Macau and Goa represent final acts in the theater of decline. Both were small, persistent outposts that endured long after the imperial mainstream had dissipated. Goa's annexation by India in 1961 marked a blunt end to a centuries-long presence, an episode that embarrassed Lisbon and presaged the unraveling to come. Macau lingered until 1999, a symbolic handing over of a century of maritime entanglement. Each transfer revealed that empires can be stubborn sleepers, clinging to footholds until the political weather finally lifts them away. The language of power transmitted by the Portuguese left traces that survive: Creole languages, place names, religious syncretism, and culinary legacies that mix Africa, Asia, and Europe into new palettes. Cape Verdean Morna music carries the melancholy rhythm of Atlantic crossings. Brazilian samba and capoeira carry African survivals braided into new expressions. Dome churches and Macanese cuisine blend spices and saints. These cultural afterlives are not mere souvenirs. They are living evidence that empire reconfigures identities as much as it rearranges borders. Yet memory is contested. For some, the Portuguese era is a source of pride, stories of brave navigators and shared cultural ties. For others, it is a history of violence, the forced labor, the burned villages, the broken families, the commodification of human life. Memory politics in former colonies and in Portugal itself are still navigating these contradictory inheritances. Monuments raise debates and schoolbooks get rewritten as societies decide what to commemorate and what to atone for. This conversation is itself a continuation of the empire's long shadows. Economically, the empire's fall reshaped global patterns. The end of colonies transformed raw material flows, opened opportunities for new trading partnerships, and sometimes left economies dependent on a single export. Former colonies faced the curse of monoculture economies and the need to diversify while dealing with the costs inflicted by decades of extraction. International donors and new bilateral partners stepped in, and the geopolitics of the Cold War injected resources as well as new alignments, further complicating post-colonial development. The Portuguese state, for its part, went through a wrenching reinvention. The loss of empire undermined a particular kind of national identity anchored in global reach, producing a moment of introspection and political change. The transition from authoritarian Estado Novo to a democratic republic opened social possibilities and economic realignment. Portugal joined the European project, found new markets, and reoriented itself northward toward Europe. This shift did not erase the debt of empire, but it altered the national horizon, offering new frameworks for remembering and responsibility. In the decades after decolonization, diasporas formed as waves of returnees, settlers, and displaced peoples moved across oceans, carrying languages and claims with them. Portuguese-speaking African refugees arrived in Lisbon, bringing with them styles of dress, plaintive accents, and stories of lost homes. They transformed neighborhoods, introduced new foods, and complicated the story of national belonging in Portugal, making the metropole itself a site of post-colonial contestation and cultural fusion. The story of the Portuguese Empire cannot be told without the steady, structural brutality of the slave trade whose economic logic underpinned much of the empire's wealth. Millions of Africans were carried across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, a human commodification whose reverberations are alive in diasporas, demographic shifts, and the persistent racial hierarchies of post-colonial societies. Slavery's end did not erase those legacies but reorganized them into new forms of dependency and stratification that demanded new political and social movements to confront. Religious orders played ambiguous roles in empire building. Jesuits and other missionaries were sometimes championed as protectors of the colonized against slavery, while at other times they were agents of cultural destruction, enforcers of conversion, and allies of colonial administration. The expulsion of Jesuits by Pombal and the later suppression of religious orders illustrate how the empire's spiritual architecture could be weaponized or dismantled according to political need. The monasteries and missions left behind libraries, schools, and architecture, but also a contested legacy of cultural erasure and resilience. The environmental consequences of empire were profound and often underemphasized. Sugar monoculture in Brazil denuded soils, mining in Minas Gerais reconfigured river systems, and the harvest of certain spices or timbers altered island ecologies irrevocably. The Portuguese introduced new crops, animals, and agricultural practices that reshaped landscapes and sometimes precipitated famine when extraction was prioritized over sustainability. Colonial environmental governance privileged extraction for metropolitan profit, and the ecological debts incurred were as permanent as the political ones. Maritime technology and shipbuilding were among Portugal's most durable contributions to world history. Caravels and later the heavy carracks represented advances in naval architecture that made global navigation possible and inspired copycats across Europe. Lisbon became a node of naval knowledge, pilot charts, and navigational schools whose techniques diffused through the continent. That technical inheritance paradoxically outlived political control, seeding a European capability for oceanic empire that went beyond Portugal itself. Yet for all that innovation, corruption, mismanagement, and underfunding often weakened the empire's ability to hold its farthest posts. Revenues were siphoned by local elites, royal favorites, and inefficient bureaucracies, and in times of crisis Lisbon often found itself unable to reinforce distant garrisons. This administrative brittleness converted local revolts into existential threats and allowed rival empires to exploit cracks in Portuguese authority. The empire's architecture was elegant in design but fragile in maintenance. Popular resistance manifested not only in open rebellion but in everyday acts of evasion and obstruction, work slowdowns, flight, the refusal to register births or cadastral changes, and the persistence of indigenous legal practices that undermined colonial jurisdiction. Imagine a coastline at dawn where wooden holes cut through silver water and every horizon promises a new map. This is where the story of Portugal's empire begins, not as a sudden conquest but as an accumulation of curiosity, craft, and a stubborn willingness to follow wind and current. Small in territory but large in imagination, the country on the edge of Europe sent ships into the unknown and brought back more than spices. Those voyages rewove the fabric of the world, and their threads are still visible in language, architecture, and taste. You can feel the ambition that sparked those voyages if you listen to the rhythm of oars and sails in the oldest accounts, an almost musical cadence that repeats across centuries. Prince Henry, later known as Henry the Navigator, did not sail every ship, but he created a culture of exploration by funding voyages, setting up shipyards, and gathering knowledge. He built an institution of curiosity in Sagres where pilots, mapmakers, and merchants gathered to pool information about winds, currents, and coastlines. That practical knowledge turned into maps that became passports to influence and power. The technology mattered. The caravel, with its lateen sails, was nimble and built to hug unknown coasts. The now, larger and capable of carrying treasure and colonists, changed the scale of what voyages could accomplish. Sailors learned to read the wind, to follow the dance of trade winds and monsoons, and to use the astrolabe and crossstaff to find latitude on open water. These were not mere gadgets but the instruments of an expanding worldview, instruments that allowed small Portugal to reach India and beyond. The mastery of seamanship became a national art and a commercial advantage. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut in 1498, the world shifted in a single season. The ocean had been a barrier between Europe and Asia, suddenly it became a highway. Spices, textiles, and the quest for direct access to Asian markets drove Portuguese policy, and the crown saw naval power as a means to secure trade rather than simply to occupy territory. Establishing factories, which were trading posts fortified against rivals, allowed Portuguese merchants to insert themselves into existing trade networks rather than supplant them entirely. This network spread in startling directions. On the west coast of Africa, forts rose like punctuation marks. São Jorge de Mina, later called Elmina, became a hub of gold and human trade. In the Indian Ocean, Goa became an administrative center, where Portuguese law, Catholicism, and local customs mixed in uneasy but enduring ways. In Southeast Asia, Malacca was a prize, controlling the strait and the flow of spices from the Moluccas. On the far eastern edge, a tiny settlement in China named Macau became a bridge between worlds, legally seated and practically vital for trade with the Middle Kingdom. These settlements behaved differently depending on geography, resources, and local politics. Some, like Goa, became complex cities with churches, convents, markets, and layers of Portuguese and local populations. Others, like the fortress at Dio or the trading posts along the Swahili coast, served primarily as military and commercial outposts, designed to project power and secure shipping routes. The Portuguese rarely attempted to govern vast inland territories at first. Their model was maritime control. That strategy allowed a small kingdom to punch far above its weight for a time. Trade brought wealth but also violence. The spice trade was not merely about flavoring food, it was about access to commodities that commanded enormous value in Europe. Portugal used military force when negotiation failed, and sieges and naval battles shaped the geography of power. At the same time, diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the creation of client states were used to manage complex relationships with local rulers. The result was a mosaic of influence where Portuguese presence varied from dominant to peripheral, depending on the context. Religion was a parallel force in these encounters. Jesuits and Franciscan friars followed merchants and soldiers, building churches and schools, translating religious texts, and engaging in missionary work. Conversion was seldom straightforward. It took root among some communities and was resisted by others, blending in ways that created new spiritual practices. In Goa, for example, Catholic rituals layered over Hindu traditions in ways that reshaped social life. In Japan, Portuguese missionaries first found open doors and later faced persecution, showing how delicate religious encounters could be when politics shifted. Language traveled with the ships, embedding itself in surprising places. Portuguese served as a lingua franca in parts of Africa and Asia, and from that mix sprang Creole languages that endured. In Cape Verde, in Guinea-Bissau, and parts of India and Southeast Asia, local languages absorbed Portuguese words and grammar, and new hybrid tongues like Kristang in Malaysia or Macanese Patois evolved. Even where Portuguese did not become dominant, it left behind a scattering of place names and family names that act as historical fossils. Those linguistic traces are living evidence of interconnected pasts. The empire's economic model rested on networks linking production, transport, and consumption. Sugar plantations in Brazil required capital, labor, and markets in a triangular system that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Portuguese were early movers in the Atlantic plantation economy, using enslaved labor to grow crops that fed an expanding European appetite. The social and human cost of this model was immense, creating demographic shifts and cultural trauma that echo through generations. Portugal's role in the transatlantic slave trade is an essential and painful part of any honest account of the empire. Brazil emerged as the crown jewel of colonial enterprise, but it took time to transform from a series of coastal settlements into an integrated colony and then a kingdom. Sugar initially drove settlement and plantation culture, and the landscape was irreversibly changed as forests were cleared and new ecosystems forced their way into the colonial economy. Over time, gold and diamonds altered the focus of extraction and attracted waves of fortune seekers, changing the social fabric. The presence of the Portuguese court in Rio de Janeiro for a period in the early 19th century flipped imperial dynamics and presaged Brazilian independence. Back in Europe, the Treaty of Tordesillas had attempted to divide the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, drawing a line in the Atlantic that shaped the map of colonization. That papal-sanctioned decision gave Brazil its Portuguese language, but the line was also a symbol of the European willingness to partition lands whose inhabitants were rarely consulted. Competition with other European powers, especially the Dutch, English, and French, meant that Portuguese holdings were perpetually contested. Over the centuries, the empire contracted and expanded according to naval strength, economic pressure, and diplomatic maneuvering. Rivals tested Portuguese dominance. The Dutch East India Company targeted Spice Islands, wresting control over parts of Indonesia and inflicting heavy losses on Portuguese traders. The English and French, with growing navies and merchant networks, chipped away at trade monopolies. Yet Portugal retained strategic ports and alliances, including a long-standing Anglo-Portuguese alliance that often shifted the balance of power. This competition forced Portuguese authorities to adapt, sometimes by fortifying positions and sometimes by focusing on niche strengths like Brazil's sugar or the coastal trade in Africa. Architecture became a visible signature of empire. Manuline style, a richly ornamented late Gothic architecture, celebrated maritime motifs, ropes, spheres, and seaweed, making stone sing of navigation. Churches and monasteries in India and Brazil bore the imprint of Portugal's aesthetic sensibility, often adapted to local materials and labor. Fortresses, pragmatic and imposing, dotted coasts from Africa to Asia, testifying to the intersection of military design and global trade. Town planning in colonial cities reflected Portuguese notions of order, with plazas, churches, and administrative centers arranged to manifest sovereignty. Cultural exchange was not one-directional. Local arts absorbed Portuguese techniques and materials, producing hybrid forms. In Goa, for instance, Christian iconography was sometimes painted by Hindu artisans who used local pigment and brushwork, resulting in devotional images that blended visual vocabularies. In Brazil, indigenous knowledge of crops and landscape mixed with African agricultural techniques and European modes of production to create new cultural forms. These exchanges shaped cuisine, music, and ritual in ways that persist long after political control ended. Just as goods moved, ideas traveled. Cartography, for example, improved as explorers returned with detailed observations, gradually shifting the European understanding of the world's geography. Scientific knowledge grew in base rooms and libraries, and navigational manuals compiled the experience of generations of sailors. At the same time, missionaries translated local texts and naturalists collected specimens, feeding European curiosity and reshaping scientific discourse. The Portuguese Empire acted as a conduit for knowledge that would help create the modern world. But there was a darker thread woven into these achievements. Slavery and forced labor were integral to the empire's economy, displacing millions and causing cultural ruptures. In Africa, the trade in human beings fed all manner of colonial projects, and the social consequences have been profound and enduring. The moral contradictions of an empire that spread Christianity while profiting from bondage created tensions that would haunt both colonizers and the colonized. These contradictions are part of the legacy that modern societies must confront and understand. The human landscape of the empire was complex and mobile. Sailors, soldiers, merchants, missionaries, and slaves all moved across oceans, creating diasporas and mixed communities. Families of mixed descent emerged in many ports, often occupying liminal spaces both socially and culturally. In some places, Portuguese settlers assimilated into local societies, and others, small European enclaves maintained distinct identities. The cultural hybridity produced by this mobility is central to understanding the social texture of the empire. Economic decline followed the loss of monopoly and the rise of competitors, but it was not a sudden collapse. By the 17th century, the effective power of the Portuguese crown had diminished in many parts of the world as the Dutch and English took control of lucrative routes. Portugal adapted by consolidating other territories and by forging commercial strategies that relied on diplomacy as much as force. The empire endured in various forms, but the image of unbroken Portuguese dominance faded as European rivalry intensified and local actors gained strength. Back home, political and economic strains would culminate in dramatic moments like the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. That catastrophe destroyed much of the capital, killed tens of thousands, and prompted Europe to rethink urban planning and disaster response. The Marquis of Pombal led a program of reconstruction that modernized the city, strengthened administrative institutions, and reasserted royal authority. Yet the quake also revealed the fragility at the heart of imperial power. Even a well-established maritime empire could be shaken by forces of nature and human error. The Napoleonic invasions of the early 19th century brought another upheaval when the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, transforming the colony's status and temporarily reversing the direction of imperial prestige. The court in Rio de Janeiro elevated Brazil from colony to kingdom, altering administrative structures and legitimizing local elites. When the monarch returned to Portugal, the political bonds loosened, and independence movements found fertile ground. Brazil's independence in 1822 was both a rupture and a continuity, as elites negotiated new sovereignty while maintaining ties and cultural affinities. Africa's colonial story continued through the 19th and 20th centuries as Portugal sought to consolidate inland control in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa pressured Portugal to transform coastal enclaves into territorial colonies with borders and administrative systems. Resistance and cooperation shaped these transformations, and the costs of maintaining an empire became increasingly burdensome. The colonial wars of the 20th century would eventually play a decisive role in dismantling Portugal's overseas possessions. In Asia, Portuguese presence diminished but left resilient marks. Macau remained a unique space where Portuguese legal frameworks blended with Chinese oversight, creating a hybrid jurisdiction that lasted until its handover to China in 1999. East Timor became a distant outpost with a complicated path, declared independent and later invaded, eventually achieving full sovereignty in 2002. Goa retained its distinct identity long after Portugal's grip weakened, and its incorporation into independent India in 1961 closed an imperial chapter. These transitions underscore how colonial legacies are negotiated and contested over time. The 20th century brought dictatorship and repression under Estado Novo, and the costs of maintaining colonial possessions persisted as international pressure and local resistance grew. Decolonization movements across Africa and Asia gained momentum after World War II, and Portugal's attempt to suppress independence movements drained resources and legitimacy. The Carnation Revolution of 1974, a peaceful military-led coup, toppled the authoritarian regime and began the rapid process of decolonization. The sudden withdrawal from Africa created both opportunities for self-determination and tragic moments of violence and ambiguity. The end of empire did not mean the end of Portuguese influence. The Lusophone world, nations that share Portuguese as a language, formed a kind of cultural commonwealth, with institutions designed to foster cooperation. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and even Macau in its final decades maintained links through language, legal traditions, and shared history. These relationships are not uniform, they are shaped by unequal histories, economic interests, and cultural exchanges that still require care and critical reflection. Architecture and urban forms left by the empire became both tourist attractions and contested symbols. Churches and forts attract visitors who marvel at their beauty, while local residents might see them as reminders of colonization. Conservation efforts face ethical questions: whose history is preserved, whose stories are told, and how should the past be contextualized? Museums and memorials have become important arenas for negotiating memory, balancing pride and shared heritage with acknowledgement of suffering and exploitation. Foodways are among the most tangible and delightful legacies. The Columbian exchange and other trade routes redistributed crops worldwide, and Portugal was a conduit for many of those movements. Cassava, manioc, and certain tropical fruits traveled to Africa and Asia, while European culinary practices mingled with indigenous and African traditions in Brazil and Goa. Spices that had motivated many voyages remained central to cuisines, but they were no longer exotic commodities. They were everyday flavors that defined regional identities. Music carries memory in a way that feels intimate. Fado, the Portuguese musical genre suffused with saudade, resonates as an expression of longing that can be read both as personal melancholy and as a cultural response to loss and distance. In diaspora communities, musical forms evolved further. Brazilian samba and bossa nova arose from Afro-Brazilian roots intertwined with Portuguese influence, while Afro-Portuguese rhythms found new expression in Lusophone Africa. These musical forms are living archives of migration, pain, joy, and adaptation. Language remains one of the most stubbornly persistent legacies. Portuguese is spoken by hundreds of millions of people, and its global presence makes it a major world language. But it is not a monolith. Regional variants in Brazil, Africa, and Asia display different accents, vocabularies, and syntactic quirks. Creole languages that emerged in ports and plantations are vibrant evidence of how new linguistic forms can arise from contact, survival, and necessity. These languages carry memory in idioms, proverbs, and everyday speech. Legal and administrative legacies persist beneath the surface. Civil law systems introduced by the Portuguese shaped bureaucracy, property regimes, and judicial traditions in many colonies. Some colonial legal codes lingered into the post-colonial period, affecting land tenure, commercial law, and governance. Reformers and post-colonial legislatures grappled with the task of untangling colonial frameworks to create laws more in tune with local needs. The process was never straightforward, mixing continuity with innovation and often replicating inequalities that needed redress. Material culture, tools, ceramics, religious objects, and textiles traveled with people and ships, creating hybrid material worlds. Portuguese ceramics combined European glazes with designs influenced by Islamic art and local motifs, and the azulejo tile tradition became a hallmark of Iberian and colonial interiors. Local artisans adopted techniques and created objects for hybrid markets, producing goods that appealed to Europeans and colonized elites in different ways. Over time, these objects became embedded in local aesthetics, sometimes serving new symbolic functions. Forts and maritime infrastructure are practical reminders of an empire built on control of sea lanes. Pedreiro stones, those squat stone markers erected along coasts, bear witness to early claims of discovery and territorial markers. Lighthouses, wharves, and warehouses illustrate the logistical networks that made long-distance trade possible. The physical infrastructure endured even when political sovereignty changed hands, shaping port towns and coastal economies well into the modern era. Beyond physical structures, memory takes shape in rituals and festivals that mix Catholic feasts with local celebrations. Processions, saints' days, and harvest rituals often incorporate elements derived from Portuguese religion, fused with indigenous and African practices. These ceremonies can be deeply local, celebrating community identity and continuity across generations. Such public rituals offer a way to understand how people have made sense of layered histories in everyday life. Education and missionary activity had long-term effects on literacy and intellectual life. Missionary schools introduced European curricula, which sometimes displaced indigenous learning and sometimes preserved knowledge by translating local texts. Universities and seminaries in colonial centers trained administrators and clergy who would shape local governance. After independence, education systems inherited this mixed legacy and faced the challenge of creating curricula that reflected national histories and priorities. In the realm of science, plant exchanges and natural history collections enriched European understanding of biodiversity. Portuguese voyages brought back not just spices but also specimens, plants, animals, and minerals that contributed to the scientific revolution. Naturalists cataloged species, sometimes erasing indigenous knowledge while also building new taxonomies that incorporated local expertise. The entangled history of science and empire is visible in herbaria, museum collections, and catalogs that survive to this day. Fashion and textiles were another vector of exchange. Cloth styles, dyeing techniques, and weaving patterns moved between continents, resulting in new sartorial languages. In parts of Africa and Asia, European cloth became a status symbol, while in Brazil, plantation elites developed styles that blended European fashions with tropical practicality. The global movement of fabrics created markets and social signals, and the preferences of elites often dictated trade patterns with wider consequences. The Portuguese Empire was also a story of navigation by knowledge networks. Sailors, pilots, merchants, and explorers shared secrets and manuscripts that circulated in ports from Lisbon to Goa. Pilots' guides recorded the hazards and safe harbors that allowed long voyages to be repeated successfully. This oral and written infrastructure, letters, logs, port records, created an information economy as important as ships and cannons. The slow accumulation of navigational intelligence often mattered more than any single voyage. Maps, too, are more than depictions, they are assertions of knowledge and often of power. Early Portuguese maps combined empirical observation with imaginative inference, filling blank spaces with careful speculation. With each voyage, mapmakers revised coastlines, recorded river mouths, and sketched islands once only rumored. Maps both reflected the state of knowledge and shaped political decisions about where to invest and where to fight, turning cartography into an instrument of imperial ambition. The legal doctrine of mare clausum, the idea that seas could be closed to other powers, justified early Portuguese attempts to control trade routes. It clashed with emerging ideas of residential publica and freedom of the seas held by England and others, producing a legal debate about the governance of global commons. The contest over who could dominate the ocean was therefore not only a matter of ships but of law, philosophy, and diplomacy. These intellectual battles informed maritime law in ways that shape modern international norms. It is important to recognize the ecological impact of empire. Plantation economies transformed landscapes by introducing monoculture and new species, sometimes to the detriment of biodiversity. The demand for timber for shipbuilding led to deforestation in several regions, while the global movement of species permanently altered ecosystems. Environmental change was both a consequence and a driver of economic policy, and it often had uneven effects on local populations who bore the brunt of ecological disruption. Another strand of the legacy is the spread of crops and food practices. Portuguese sailors and merchants were agents in the transformation of diets, carrying peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, and chocolate across oceans. These ingredients landed in soils and kitchens far from their origins and were reimagined by local cooks. The culinary map of the modern world cannot be understood without acknowledging these exchanges, which redefined taste and nutrition in global terms. Art and literature reflected and shaped the perceptions of empire. Travel narratives and chronicles told tales of exotic lands and peoples, often through European eyes, reinforcing both wonder and prejudice. At the same time, local storytellers incorporated new realities into oral histories, creating counter-narratives that complicated official accounts. The interplay of written and oral traditions produced a rich tapestry of interpretation, where myth and fact braided together to create shared cultural memory. Maritime law, navigation rules, and commercial contracts used by merchants in Lisbon found echoes in port cities worldwide. Merchants and legal practitioners developed shared practices to manage risk, credit, and insurance, sometimes improvising solutions in distant harbors. These commercial customs, while pragmatic, often carried the stamp of Portuguese legal culture and influenced broader commercial law. The mechanics of trade, the letters of credit, the freight agreements, the insurance policies, created institutional knowledge that outlived the political empire. Forts and defensive works were also laboratories of military engineering. Designers adapted to local conditions, using stone, earthworks, and bastions in innovative ways. Fortresses like Fort Jesus on Mombasa show how military architecture adapted to tropical climates and the realities of siege warfare. The art of coastal defense was therefore a field of invention, where local materials and global techniques combined to produce enduring monuments. Urban life in colonial ports had its own rhythms and hierarchies. Markets buzzed with traders from many worlds, and scents of spices, smoke, and sea mingled in public squares. Social stratification was visible in residential areas, with European quarters often separated from indigenous and mixed neighborhoods. Yet those divisions were porous, negotiated daily through commerce, marriage, and art. Ports were places of continual improvisation where identities were negotiated in real time. The Imperial Archive is voluminous because the empire operated through documentation, contracts, notarial records, ship logs, and correspondence. Historians mine these sources to reconstruct networks, see the movement of people and goods, and understand daily life across centuries. But the archives are partial, slanted toward those who wrote and kept records, often neglecting the voices of the enslaved, the marginalized, and the colonized. Recovering those missing voices requires creative methods and a willingness to read absence as a historical trace. Science and medicine traveled too, sometimes in ways that saved lives and sometimes in ways that imposed foreign practices. European medicine clashed with local healing traditions, and missionaries often brought Western-trained doctors who offered care alongside proselytizing. Local knowledge of herbs and treatments, however, remained invaluable, and cross-cultural medical exchanges were common. The history of health under empire reveals the limits of medical authority and the importance of plural systems of care. The empire fostered a complex legal geography where multiple legal systems overlapped: customary law, customary maritime practices, royal decrees, and church courts. Individuals often navigated this patchwork by choosing jurisdictions that suited their interests, creating legal pluralism. This legal plurality sometimes offered protection and sometimes enforced inequality, depending on context and the local balance of power. Understanding colonial law thus requires attention to both written codes and the lived practices of justice. In many places, architecture and urban planning reflected a negotiation between European models and local needs. Churches faced monsoon winds and were adapted in their design. Houses included verandas and thick walls to cope with heat. Portuguese engineers and local builders collaborated, creating hybrid building techniques that were both functional and beautiful. These built environments are living classrooms for how cultures borrow, adapt, and innovate. Marriage and kinship patterns changed with the arrival of new populations, producing families that mixed European, African, and Asian inheritances. These blended families could create networks of trade and influence, with kinship sometimes serving as a bridge between different social worlds. In other cases, rigid hierarchies aimed to preserve distinctions and privileges, shaping social policy. The interplay of intimacy and power reveals how personal lives were deeply political in colonial contexts. The idea of lusotropicalism emerged in the 20th century as a way to present Portuguese colonialism as uniquely benign, emphasizing cultural mixing and miscegenation. This narrative glossed over coercion and exploitation, but it gained political traction as a way for Portugal to defend its colonial policies. Scholars have since challenged this romanticized view, pointing to material inequalities, forced labor, and violent repression. Debates about lusotropicalism show how memory and ideology can be marshaled to justify or contest imperial legacies. Mercantile networks that once flowed through Portuguese ports reconfigured themselves after independence and decolonization. Shipping routes shifted, new flags sailed the seas, and former colonial subjects reorganized their economies to serve national needs and global markets. Trade did not end with empire, it changed shape, sometimes reproducing old patterns and sometimes breaking them. The continuing economic links among Lusophone countries reflect both historical ties and modern geopolitical strategies. The cultural diplomacy that followed decolonization aimed to maintain ties while acknowledging historical wrongs. Portugal and former colonies negotiated bilateral relationships that involved aid, investment, cultural exchange, and difficult conversations about restitution and memory. These negotiations often revealed unequal power dynamics, but they also opened spaces for collaboration in language promotion, education, and cultural heritage. The challenge has been to build partnerships that respect sovereignty and rectify historical imbalances. Contested heritage sites force societies to decide how to remember the past. Should museums display colonial trophies, or should they be returned? Who tells the story at a restored fort, and whose narrative is prioritized? These questions are not merely academic, they provoke passions and policy decisions. The way communities confront these dilemmas reveals their willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths and to imagine more inclusive narratives. The Portuguese diaspora contributes to the living legacy of empire in cities around the world. Migrant communities brought their customs and created new cultural scenes in metropolitan centers from Lisbon to Toronto, from Paris to Johannesburg. Diaspora networks support business, political, and familial ties across continents, and they mobilize memory in celebrations, memoirs, and culinary traditions. These populations are testaments to the human mobility that empire both produced and accelerated. Collective memory is shaped by literature that grapples with past injustices and by films that dramatize migration and identity. Contemporary writers from Lusophone countries often interrogate colonial histories in prose and poetry, asking readers to consider the costs of empire. Film and theater bring those narratives to new audiences, making history visceral and immediate. The arts are crucial spaces for reflection, reconciliation, and imagining futures beyond the constraints of inherited stories. Education systems have had to incorporate colonial history into curricula in ways that are honest and nuanced. Teaching the past requires balancing national pride with critical appraisal of oppression and exploitation. Younger generations face the responsibility of learning and interpreting complex histories while inheriting modern political realities. How societies teach empire shapes civic understanding and influences how future policies address inequality and historical memory. Museums play a vital role in shaping public understanding of the empire. Their displays can either sanitize or complicate narratives, depending on curatorial choices. Exhibitions that integrate local voices, contextualize objects, and confront uncomfortable truths offer pathways to meaningful dialogue. When museums collaborate with descended communities, they can transform relics of empire into sites of education and reconciliation. Economic development in former colonies has been uneven, and structural legacies of empire play a part in contemporary inequalities. Infrastructure built to extract resources did not always support broader development objectives, and land tenure systems imposed by colonial administrations sometimes hindered post-colonial reform. Efforts to address these inequities have ranged from redistribution policies to foreign investment and technical assistance, but the shadows of colonial economic structures still complicate progress. In recent decades, debates over restitution have intensified, whether about Benin bronzes housed in European museums or Portuguese artifacts held abroad. Calls for repatriation are ethical and political, rooted in claims for dignity and historical justice. Institutions are slowly responding, sometimes through loans, sometimes through return, and sometimes through shared custody arrangements. These processes are messy and slow, but they signal a changing global consciousness about ownership and the right to cultural heritage. Tourism both preserves and commodifies imperial sites. Visitors flock to colonial churches, forts, and neighborhoods, often guided by narratives that emphasize aesthetics over history. Responsible tourism, however, can empower local communities, fund preservation, and promote complex storytelling. The way tourism is managed determines whether a site becomes a superficial spectacle or a space for education and local benefit. Religion continues to be woven into public life in many Lusophone countries, shaped by centuries of Christian missionary activity as well as pre-existing spiritual traditions. Catholicism remains influential, but it is frequently blended with indigenous and African practices in syncretic forms. Newer religious movements and secularization trends further diversify the spiritual landscape. Religion's role in social cohesion and public debate demonstrates the persistence of spiritual legacies from the imperial era. Political relationships between Portugal and its former colonies range from warm alliances to contentious negotiations over memory and reparations. Diplomatic ties have evolved from hierarchical colonial frameworks to more equal partnerships, but asymmetries persist, especially in economic relations and migration policies. Bilateral forums, cultural institutions, and trade agreements attempt to manage these complexities. The diplomacy of memory shapes how states work together and recognize shared histories. Science and scholarship on the empire have matured, with historians and anthropologists producing nuanced accounts that foreground marginalized voices. Post-colonial studies have pushed the field to reconsider assumptions and to incorporate interdisciplinary methods. Oral histories, archaeological digs, and community-engaged research help reveal the lived experiences that official records omit. Scholarship continues to complicate our understanding of the Portuguese Empire, showing it as a mosaic of encounters rather than a single story. Genealogies and DNA studies are sometimes used to trace the human movements prompted by empire, revealing genetic threads that crisscross continents. These scientific approaches confirm the deep intermixing that occurred, providing biological echoes of cultural and demographic shifts. Genetic knowledge can be illuminating, but it must be handled in ways that respect privacy and avoid reductive interpretations of identity. Scientific data becomes meaningful when combined with historical and personal narratives. Sports and recreational practices also traveled across oceans. Football, for example, became a universal language in Lusophone countries, bringing people together in new civic spaces. Sporting events provided arenas for national expression and pride, sometimes serving as pressure valves during political unrest. Shared sporting cultures contribute to an ongoing emotional connection between nations once linked by empire. Contemporary literature continues to mine the past for stories that speak to present challenges. Writers from former colonies often explore themes of identity, memory, migration, and resistance, asking readers to confront colonial legacies in intimate ways. Novels, memoirs, and poetry transform archive fragments into human stories, making history accessible and personal. These literary works connect personal memory to broader historical currents. The question of restitution extends beyond objects to intangible heritage, rituals, recipes, and languages that have been suppressed or marginalized. Reviving endangered Creole languages or reclaiming traditional ceremonies can be acts of cultural recovery and sovereignty. Cultural resilience is visible in community efforts to teach languages, preserve music, and document oral histories. These projects are grassroots forms of healing, rebuilding what empire tried to fragment. Economic ties and migration shape modern Lusophone networks, with remittances, investment, and cultural exchange flowing across oceans. Migrant communities maintain strong links to their homelands, supporting families and businesses through transnational networks. At the same time, migration poses challenges for integration and social policy in receiving countries. Managing these flows productively requires policies grounded in respect and historical awareness. Portuguese identity itself has been reshaped by the empire and its end, with modern Portugal embracing a multicultural reality that includes descendants of colonial subjects and migrant communities. This transformation is visible in food, music, and civic life, and it invites reflection on national memory and identity. Portugal's own reckoning with its past has been a slow process of civic debate, institutional reform, and cultural negotiation. The story of Portuguese identity is one of adaptation and redefinition. In the realm of policy, former imperial powers and newly independent states face joint challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and health crises. Collaborative approaches can leverage shared language and historical ties to address urgent problems, but they must be rooted in equality and mutual respect. International cooperation among Lusophone countries offers potential for coordinated responses to shared threats. The legacy of empire can be mobilized for collective good if it is acknowledged honestly. Memory work includes monuments and commemorations that honor complex pasts. Statues and plaques sometimes celebrate explorers and statesmen, but they can also be sites of protest and contestation. Debates over recontextualizing monuments, adding explanatory plaques, or building counter-monuments illustrate how societies can transform static memorials into dynamic conversations. These civic dialogues are essential for democratic reckoning with history. At the grassroots level, community-led museums and cultural centers tell alternative stories of empire, centering voices that have too often been marginalized in national narratives. These spaces offer intimate, lived perspectives on history, allowing descendants to narrate their own stories. Community curation fosters ownership and ensures that exhibitions resonate with lived experience rather than distant scholarly abstraction. When local voices lead, memory can become a tool for healing and empowerment. Environmental restoration projects sometimes address damages incurred during the colonial period, such as deforestation or soil depletion caused by plantations. Reclaiming land and restoring ecosystems are acts that have ecological and symbolic importance, signaling a break from exploitative land use. These efforts often involve local knowledge and international support, blending conservation science with community priorities. Restoring landscapes can help mend the wounds of an extractive past. The Portuguese language's global footprint supports cultural exchange and diplomacy in ways that are practical and effective. Language policy, education exchange programs, and cultural festivals keep connections alive, promoting mutual understanding. But language can also obscure histories of oppression when it is used to gloss over colonial violence. Honest cultural diplomacy balances pride in shared language with recognition of the asymmetries of the past. Academic collaboration among scholars from Portugal and former colonies has produced richer, more inclusive histories. Joint research projects and co-authored publications deepen understanding and ensure that scholarship reflects diverse perspectives. These partnerships help dismantle old hierarchies of knowledge and build intellectual communities that bridge continents. Collaborative scholarship is a concrete way of rewriting the story of empire with greater justice. The aesthetic legacies of the empire, tiles, carvings, and stained glass, continue to inspire artists and designers who mine historical forms for contemporary expression. Fashion designers draw on colonial-era textiles, architects reference Manuline motifs, and visual artists repurpose historical objects to comment on modern themes. This appropriation and reinterpretation can be transformative, offering ways to reclaim and reinterpret cultural elements. Artistic engagement with the past can challenge viewers to see history anew. In urban planning, former colonial cities faced the task of balancing heritage conservation with social needs like housing and public services. Preserving historic centers can attract tourism and investment, but it can also displace residents if not managed equitably. Inclusive urban policies strive to integrate heritage protection with affordable housing and community benefit. The politics of urban preservation reveal tensions between market forces and collective cultural heritage. The psychological legacies of empire are subtle and pervasive, shaping how people see themselves and others. Post-colonial identities often grapple with inherited narratives of inferiority or superiority, creating internal tensions that affect social cohesion. Healing these psychological wounds requires education, public storytelling, and spaces for open dialogue. National narratives must allow for complexity and contradiction to foster healthier collective identities. Sports and cultural festivals often provide neutral ground for bridging historical divides and celebrating shared humanity. Events that highlight Lusophone culture, music festivals, film festivals, and sporting tournaments bring people together across borders. These gatherings can be joyful spaces where painful histories are acknowledged through art, conversation, and shared celebration. Cultural events underscore the capacity of human creativity to transform sorrow into communal life. The future of Lusophone connections depends on honest engagement with the past and imaginative collaboration for shared prosperity. Political leaders, civil society, and ordinary citizens all play roles in shaping equitable relationships grounded in mutual respect. Initiatives in education, trade, and cultural exchange can build bridges, provided they confront historical injustices rather than paper them over. The deep entanglements of history can be a source of wisdom if acknowledged candidly. For the traveler who crosses old maritime routes today, each port retains a layer of stories, some visible and some whispered in alleyways and markets. Old warehouses have become museums, and colonial facades house new businesses and social enterprises. Yet beneath that visible continuity lies a palimpsest of other lives and stories, those of laborers, artists, and families who made history in quieter ways. Walking those streets, one senses the complex relationship between memory and daily life. Ultimately, the Portuguese Empire's legacy is neither solely heroic nor wholly condemnable. It is a complex human record of curiosity, ingenuity, exploitation, adaptation, and resilience. Its echoes are felt in languages, cuisines, music, and legal systems, as well as in scars that demand redress. A careful listener will notice how past and present converse in every port of call where Portuguese influence was once strong. To engage with that legacy is to accept complexity, to grieve losses, and to celebrate survival and adaptation. There is a moral task embedded in studying this history, to remember without romanticizing and to critique without erasing. Future generations benefit from such balanced remembrance because it fosters empathy and practical lessons about power, responsibility, and the costs of commerce untethered from ethics. Learning from the past yields tools for better futures, provided those lessons are taught with honesty and courage. The Portuguese Empire teaches the world about the possibilities and perils of global connection. As you move through cities shaped by that history, whether passing historic plazas or listening to music that blends continents, allow a moment of reflection. Consider the hands that built the ships, the markets where goods changed hands, the families who navigated the crossings. The echoes of empire are not static relics, they are living threads in a global fabric that continues to be woven. In recognizing that, we open pathways toward reconciliation, creativity, and shared futures. History should be a conversation, not a verdict. When scholars, artists, and citizens continue to interrogate sources, honor missing voices, and work toward restitution, the past becomes a resource for transformation. Portugal and its former colonies can cooperate to turn painful memories into fertile ground for justice and creativity. That transformation is ongoing, demanding attention, humility, and sustained action. Listening to the world shaped by these centuries, we hear layered languages and layered lives, melodies that cross oceans, and kitchens where disparate spices harmonize. The Portuguese Empire's influence is a mosaic of invention and injury, resilience and rupture. Understanding that mosaic requires attention to nuance and a willingness to hold contradictions in tension. Only then can history serve as a foundation for equitable relationships and imaginative futures. Wherever you find Portuguese names on maps, you will also find stories of resistance, adaptation, and survival. Those names are invitations to ask not simply who claimed these lands, but who lived in them and how they transformed encounters into enduring cultures. The true legacy of empire resides less in monuments than in the ongoing lives of people who continue to define themselves beyond colonial categories. Their stories are the living repository of history's lessons. The sea that once separated worlds now connects them, and the echo of Portugal's maritime past hums in global trade, cultural exchange, and shared language. That hum is neither purely nostalgic nor wholly triumphant. It is a complex sound with dissonance and harmony, challenge and consolation. Listening closely, we can learn how to build connections that respect dignity and difference rather than exploit them. The voyages continue, but on different terms. Even as institutions debate restitution, communities reclaim narratives and languages, planting seeds for cultural revival. Local projects digitize archives, teach Creole languages, and renovate community centers where memories are kept alive. These grassroots efforts resist erasure and create future-oriented models for cultural resilience. They remind us that heritage belongs first to living people, not to distant museums alone. The experience of empire also teaches us about adaptation under constraint. Colonized peoples found creative ways to survive, to synthesize, and to resist, and those strategies often produced vibrant cultural innovations. From music to cuisine to governance, adaptation became a mode of survival and a source of creativity. Recognizing this resourcefulness is essential to honoring histories that are too often told as stories of victimization alone. In diplomatic halls and community centers alike, the language of partnership is now more common than the rhetoric of domination. Trade agreements and cultural pacts increasingly emphasize reciprocity and co-development. These shifts reflect a broader global trend toward equality and mutual recognition, though obstacles remain. Transformative relationships require sustained commitment and an honest accounting of the past. Finally, the Portuguese Empire's story reminds us that global history is not a one-way street. Influence traveled back to Portugal in the form of food, aesthetic inspiration, and even faith practices that reshaped metropolitan life. Coffee and sugar changed European consumption patterns, while ideas and luxury goods transformed social habits. Metropolitan cultures were themselves products of empire, reconfigured by return flows of goods and ideas that altered domestic life as much as colonial life. So the echoes remain. Language spoken in daily life, spices in home kitchens, and songs performed at festivals all trace lines back to a history that was at once intimate and planetary. Engaging with that legacy invites us to cultivate a kind of historical empathy that is practical and moral at once. It asks us to honor the complexity of human encounters, to reclaim suppressed stories, and to imagine forms of connection that learn from the past rather than repeat its injustices. And as you continue your day, driving or working and listening to these stories, let the legacy of the Portuguese Empire be a kind of instruction in scale and consequence. Small kingdoms can have outsized impacts, and everyday choices, what to plant, who to trade with, how to treat a neighbor, ripple across continents. The lessons of that expansive history are not merely academic, they are prompts for how we live together now. In that sense, the echo becomes a call to action. History invites us to travel thoughtfully through time, to find continuity and rupture woven together. The Portuguese Empire was a human creation, full of ingenuity and cruelty, of art and exploitation, of resilience and grief. The work now is to listen to all those voices, to preserve, to critique, and to build systems and cultures that respect human dignity. The legacy endures because we remember it, and remembering is the first step toward responsible change. In the end, the story stretches beyond maps and manifests into the daily rhythms of life, names called at market stalls, prayers whispered in hybrid languages, recipes passed down through generations. Those practices are not relics but living acts of remembrance, continuing the complex dialogue between past and present. They teach us about survival, creativity, and the possibility of a future informed by truth and justice. The echoes of an empire persist, and in listening we find both caution and hope. The story doesn't end in books, it lives in everything we do. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you feel that legacy more in the traditions you keep alive or in the changes you dare to make.